Hi everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to see you join me. And don't forget to like and let me know what you think in the comments. My name is Mark Williams. I'm 38, and what I'm about to tell you happened last summer, the summer of 2023. Out in the middle of nowhere. Heart Mountain National Antelope Refuge in Oregon. I went there to get away from it all, to find some peace. Maybe even figure out who I was again. Everything in my life had pretty much gone to hell. My marriage had tanked. My corporate job was soul-sucking, and every day felt like a repeat of the last. I was desperate for a change, and the wilderness felt like the best place to start over. I'd been living out of my beat-up RV for a few months, drifting from one remote campsite to another, trying to prove to myself that I could make it on my own, getting used to being alone. I heard about Heart Mountain from some old-timer in a greasy spoon diner. He called it God's country, untouched by the modern world. That was all I needed to hear. When I finally rolled into the refuge, I was blown away. It was starkly beautiful. Wide, open sagebrush plains stretching as far as the eye could see, under a sky so vast it made me feel like an ant. The air was crisp and dry, the kind that makes you feel like you're breathing in pure life. I found a spot at the base of the mountain, parked my RV, and set up camp. It was remote, no cell service, no other campers around. Just me and Buddy, my German shepherd. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I hunted rabbits, fished in a nearby creek, even managed to fix my solar panels, which were on the fritz. Buddy was in heaven, roaming around, happy and alert, while I tinkered with small projects around the camp. Nights were quiet, except for the occasional howl of coyotes in the distance. I thought I'd finally found the peace I was looking for, but on the third night, everything changed. I was sitting by the fire, just staring into the flames, when I heard it, laughter. It was faint, carried on the wind, but definitely laughter. My first thought was that there must be other campers nearby, even though I hadn't seen a single soul since I got there. Buddy growled, his ears perked, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. "Hello." I called out, my voice sounding weirdly loud in the stillness. No answer. Just the crackle of the fire and the rustling of the sagebrush. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or my imagination. But the next morning, I found something strange near the edge of my campsite. Someone had arranged a small pile of stones, perfectly balanced, in a shape I didn't recognize. Buddy sniffed at it, growling softly, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I tried to brush it off. Maybe a hiker had passed through before me. Maybe it was some harmless prank. I wasn't going to let my mind play tricks on me. But the laughter came again that night, louder this time, and it was joined by footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunches on the dry earth. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area, my heart pounding. Buddy was barking now, his fur bristling, but the light didn't reveal anything. The days that followed only got worse. My water filter cracked, spilling precious drinking water. A real disaster out there. My rifle, the one I used for target practice, jammed, something that had never happened before. And then there were the symbols. Weird shapes carved into the dirt near my RV. Ones that definitely hadn't been there the night before. They looked like runes, primitive and angular, and they always appeared after dark. On the fifth night, I saw her. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to calm my nerves when Buddy froze. His growl was low and menacing, his eyes fixed on something beyond the firelight. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw her, an old woman, frail looking, standing just outside the circle of light. Her eyes glinted, reflecting the flames like polished glass. "You shouldn't be here," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across the ground. I stood up, my flashlight in one hand, my rifle in the other. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What do you want?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a bony hand, pointed at me, and then turned and vanished into the darkness. The next morning I was packing my bag. I was leaving. This was beyond weird. I wasn't sticking around here. But when I tried to start the RV, nothing. It wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery, the fuel lines. Everything looked fine. But the damn thing wouldn't start. It was like the RV was trapped here, just like me. So, I packed a bag, strapped on my boots, and decided to hike to Plush, the nearest town. It was almost 20 miles away, but I didn't have any other options. I left Buddy to guard the RV, big mistake, and started walking. The trail was rough but doable, winding through sagebrush and over rocky ridges. About 3 miles in, I found something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Another pile of stones, exactly like the one I'd found at my campsite. It didn't make any sense. I hadn't passed anyone, and I hadn't backtracked. But there it was, right in the middle of the trail, like someone had been expecting me. I kept going, but I was seriously freaked out now. The laughter started again, faint and distant at first. Then closer. I could feel eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anyone. When I finally turned back, the trail seemed different, twisting in ways it hadn't before, leading me right back toward my camp. By the time I got back, it was getting dark. And Buddy, he was gone. His leash was lying there on the ground, untouched, but he was nowhere to be seen. I called for him until my voice was hoarse, my chest tight with fear. Hours later, I found him. He was near the base of a gnarled old tree. His body was limp, lifeless. His collar had been taken off and hung from a branch above him. Grief and rage just slammed into me. I screamed into the night, cursing whoever or whatever had done this. And then I heard her again, the witch. "You were warned," she said, her voice cutting through the darkness. I spun around and saw her standing by the fire, looking more like a shadow than a real person. My fear turned to pure rage. I raised my rifle and fired, not even aiming. The shots echoed across the mountain, but she didn't even flinch. She just smiled, this grotesque, toothless grin that made my blood run cold. I don't remember much after that. The fire flared up suddenly, blinding me, and when I opened my eyes, I was alone. Buddy's body was gone, and the symbols in the dirt around my camp, they'd changed, forming a circle that seemed to trap me inside it. I got out of there the next morning. My RV, which was dead as a doornail the day before, started up like there was never anything wrong with it. But I didn't feel relieved, just this overwhelming sense of dread. As I drove down that mountain, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw her, standing in the middle of the road, her skeletal hand raised in what looked like a silent curse. That was 6 months ago. 6 months, and I haven't had a full night's sleep since. The laughter, it follows me now, no matter where I go. And every morning, I wake up to find a pile of stones outside my door. It doesn't matter if I'm in a motel, at a friend's place, or even sleeping in my car. Those damn stones are always there. After I left Heart Mountain, I tried to tell people what happened. I went to the police in Plush, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. One of the officers, a young guy named Deputy Hayes, seemed to listen, at least a little. He told me about some local legends, stories about a witch that supposedly haunted the refuge, preying on anyone who disrespected the land. He didn't believe it, of course, called it old wives' tales. But it was more than anyone else had given me. I even tried to find out more about the history of the area. I spent hours in the library, reading about Native American folklore, early settlers' accounts, anything that might explain what I'd experienced. I found stories about skinwalkers, ancient curses, and spirits tied to the land. It was all pretty out there, but nothing that quite matched what happened to me. But here's the thing that really messes with my head. I started having these dreams, nightmares really, where I'm back at the campsite. I see the fire, the symbols in the dirt, and the old woman. But in the dreams, she's not just standing there. She's changing. Sometimes she looks like a regular old woman, frail but human. Other times, she's more like an animal. A coyote, maybe, or a raven. And sometimes, she's just wrong, like something out of a horror movie. All twisted limbs and glowing eyes. In one dream, she spoke to me. She said, "You took something that wasn't yours. Now, you belong to the mountain." I woke up in a cold sweat, heart hammering, those words echoing in my head. I knew I had to go back. I had to try to understand what was happening, to maybe even find a way to stop it. I knew it was crazy, maybe even suicidal, but I couldn't live like this anymore, haunted by the laughter and the stones. So, a few weeks ago, I went back to Heart Mountain. I drove my old beat-up pickup this time, not the RV. Part of me was worried that my RV was cursed because of that place. I parked at the same spot, that same sense of dread washing over me as I got out of the truck. The place looked the same. Vast, empty. Beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl. I brought a few things with me this time. A digital recorder, a camera, and a journal to write down everything that happened. I also brought a handgun, even though I knew it probably wouldn't do any good against whatever was out there. But it made me feel a little safer, at least. The first day was quiet. I set up a small camp, just a tent and a sleeping bag this time. No fire. I didn't want to attract any unwanted attention. I spent the day exploring the area, looking for anything that might give me a clue about what was going on. I found more of those stone piles, more of the strange symbols carved into the dirt. They seemed to be concentrated around the base of the mountain, in a kind of rough circle. As night fell, the fear started to creep in. I sat in my tent, listening to the wind whistle through the sagebrush, every nerve on edge. And then, I heard it, the laughter. Faint at first, then louder, closer. It was coming from the direction of the mountain. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The laughter stopped. I scanned the area, but I couldn't see anything. Then, I noticed something on the ground near my tent, a small, leather-bound book. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up. It was old. The leather cracked and worn. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and drawings, all in a language I didn't recognize. But as I flipped through it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Drawing of the symbols I'd seen carved in the dirt, and next to it, a drawing of the old woman, the witch. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Standing there, just outside the beam of my flashlight, was the old woman. Her eyes glinted in the darkness, reflecting the light like an animal's. "You came back," she rasped, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled, that same terrifying, toothless grin. "You know what you did," she said. "You disturbed the balance. Now, you pay the price." "I didn't mean to," I pleaded. "I just wanted some peace." "Peace," she cackled. "There is no peace for those who disrespect the mountain." She took a step closer, and I could see her more clearly now. She wasn't just old. She was ancient, like something out of time. Her skin was like leather, stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were black and bottomless, like two pools of ink. I raised my handgun, my hand shaking. "Stay back," I warned. She laughed again, a high-pitched, shrieking sound that made my ears ring. "A gun won't help you here," she said. "This is not your world." She lunged at me, moving faster than I thought possible. I fired the gun, but the bullets seemed to pass right through her, like she was made of smoke. She grabbed my arm, her grip like iron, and I screamed in pain. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was lying on the ground, my head throbbing. The old woman was gone, but the leather-bound book was still there, lying next to me. I grabbed it and ran. I didn't stop running until I was back at my truck. I threw the book in the passenger seat and drove, not stopping until I was miles away from that cursed place. I'm back in the city now, but it doesn't matter. The laughter still follows me. The stones still appear. And now, I have this book, this terrifying reminder of what I experienced. I've been trying to decipher it, to understand what it means. I think it might be some kind of journal, maybe even a spell book, belonging to the witch or someone who came before her. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I don't know if I can ever escape this curse. But I have to keep trying. I have to find a way to break the connection between me and the mountain, between me and the witch. Maybe this book holds the key. Or maybe it's just another piece of the nightmare that has become my life. One thing's for sure. I'll never forget the terror of Heart Mountain. And I'll never stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the laughter to start again. Waiting for the stones to appear, a constant reminder that I'm trapped in a horror story I don't understand, with no end in sight. My name is Ethan Hayes, and I was 38 years old when I decided to play hermit in the Wallowa Mountains. It was the winter of 2022, a time when I figured some serious alone time might fix the mess my life had become. Fresh off a divorce that had left me feeling like roadkill, and totally fed up with the never-ending buzz of Portland, I packed up my beat-up camper van, the Wanderer, with enough grub and gear to last a couple of weeks. My destination, the Eagle Cap Wilderness. I was craving space, quiet, a place to think, to write, maybe even to run away from myself for a bit. I parked the Wanderer near Lostine River, far enough from any trailhead that I wouldn't be tripping over weekend hikers. The mountains were drop-dead gorgeous, but also kind of intimidating, their jagged peaks covered in snow that seemed to glow even when the sun was just a pale smudge in the sky. The first few days were pretty awesome, I'll admit. I fished in the icy streams, scribbled in my journal like some kind of Wanab Thoru. and tried to get used to the rhythm of a life with zero distractions. Nights, though, those were tougher. The silence was so total it was almost deafening, broken only by the crackling of my campfire and the occasional rustle of wind through the pines. Then, on the fourth night, I heard it, the whisper. At first, it was just a faint thread of sound, like the wind was playing tricks on me. I told myself it was nothing, just branches creaking, maybe just my own thoughts bouncing around in my head. But as the nights went by, it got louder, clearer, and way too human sounding to ignore. A soft voice calling my name, Ethan. By the seventh night, I was practically sleepwalking. Every time I closed my eyes, the whisper would worm its way into my brain. Then, the next morning, I found footprints in the snow around my van. They definitely weren't mine, and they weren't from an animal either. They were way too big, too defined. They circled the wanderer and then just stopped, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. I tried to shrug it off. I mean, I wasn't exactly a stranger to paranoia, and the isolation was probably messing with my head. So, I doubled down on my routine, chopping extra firewood, reinforcing the little windbreak I'd built near the van. But that feeling of being watched, that unease, it just kept growing. That evening, I was cleaning a trout I'd caught when 3 hunters came out of the trees. They were all decked out in heavy camo gear, looking rough around the edges, with wind-burned faces and sharp eyes. The oldest one, a guy with a grizzled beard, who introduced himself as Caleb, nodded at me. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here this time of year," he said. "Just getting away for a while," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. But the way they were sizing me and my setup up made my skin crawl. "Well," Caleb said, "be careful. Strange things happen up here." His younger buddy, who said his name was Finn, snorted, but the third hunter, a quiet guy named Marcus, muttered something under his breath. I only caught a few words: "Hold woman," and "woods." "What was that?" I asked, but Caleb just waved me off. "Forget it, just stories, stay safe," he said. They left without another word, their boots crunching through the snow, leaving me with a serious case of the creeps. The next day, I found more footprints, but these weren't human. They were deep claw marks etched into the snow, like something heavy had dragged itself around my camp. That night, the whispers came back, louder and more insistent than ever. "Ethan, come here." I bolted the van door, clutching my rifle as the wind howled outside. Something slammed against the side of the Wander, once, then twice. I didn't sleep a wink. By morning, I was a complete wreck, my nerves shot, my thoughts all over the place. I figured a hike to higher ground might clear my head, get the blood pumping. That's when I stumbled upon the cabin. It was barely visible through the trees, a crumbling, blackened wreck of a place. I approached cautiously, my rifle at the ready. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, smelling like burnt wood and something else. Something I couldn't place. Rusted tools were scattered on the floor, and weird symbols were carved into the walls. In the center of the room was a pile of ash, arranged in a perfect circle. It looked way too deliberate to be an accident. Among the debris, I found a leather-bound journal. The handwriting inside was frantic, mostly gibberish, except for the final entry. It sent chills down my spine. "He waits beneath the mountain. Do not listen." I booked it back to the van, my heart hammering against my ribs. That night, the whispers turned into screams. "Ethan, Come to me. The van shook violently, like it was caught in a giant's grip. I fired my rifle blindly into the darkness, the recoil echoing through the trees. When the shaking stopped, I heard something else, faint footsteps, retreating into the woods. I wasn't alone out there anymore, not by a long shot. The next morning, I met Sarah. She was older, probably in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense vibe. "You look like hell," she said, handing me a steaming mug of tea. Turns out, Sarah lived off grid a few miles away and had spotted my van from a ridge. When I told her about the whispers, the footprints, and the creepy cabin, her face went dark. "You've stirred something up," she said. "This place, it doesn't take kindly to outsiders." "What does that mean?" I asked, but she wouldn't say much more. Instead, she gave me a choice to leave with her right then, or face whatever was out there alone. "I can't stay," she said, shaking her head. "Not again. I should have left, I really should have. But some messed up mix of pride, fear, and maybe just plain stubbornness kept me rooted to the spot." Sarah just shook her head and walked away, disappearing into the trees like some kind of forest spirit. That night, the whispers turned into a single voice, deep and guttural, like it was coming from the earth itself. "Ethan, join me under the mountain." When I didn't answer, when I refused, the attack started again. The van rocked like a boat in a hurricane, its windows cracking under some unseen force. My firewood pile exploded into splinters. I scrambled out of the van, rifle in hand, and followed the voice, drawn to that damn cabin like a moth to a flame. Inside, the air was so thick I could barely breathe. The ash circle started to glow faintly, and a shadowy figure began to rise from it, its form shifting and swirling like smoke. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, pure nightmare fuel. I fired, but the bullet just passed right through it. The figure lunged, and everything went black. I woke up days later in Sarah's cabin, my left leg shattered and splintered crudely. "You're lucky I found you," she said, her voice flat. She wouldn't tell me how she'd dragged me back, or what had happened to that thing from the cabin. "My van was gone," she said, "destroyed by a storm." Yeah, right. I never went back to the Wallowers. I left Sarah's cabin on crutches, hitchhiking my way back to Portland. A broken man in more ways than one. My leg never healed right, and I walk with a limp now, a constant reminder of my time in those mountains. The whispers still come sometimes, in my dreams or on lonely nights when the city is quiet. And every so often, I hear that voice, low and mocking, "Ethan, come to me." It's a promise and a threat, all rolled into one. I try to ignore it. I try to tell myself it was just a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I know the truth. Something is out there in the Wallowa Mountains, something ancient and malevolent. And it's waiting for me to come back, waiting for me to join it under the mountain. I try to focus on my new life. I found a small apartment in a quieter part of Portland. I got a job working at a bookstore. The peace of the place does wonders for my soul. But some days, when the wind is howling just right, it sounds like whispering. I met a woman named Clara. She is a painter, kind and gentle. She knows about my limp, my nightmares. She doesn't push me to talk about it. But sometimes, she catches me staring out the window, at the distant mountains. "Will you ever go back?" She asked me once. I didn't answer. I honestly don't know. Part of me wants to run as far away from that place as possible. But another part, a darker part, feels the pull, the call of the thing under the mountain. I know I can't escape it, not really. It's a part of me now, a shadow that stretches out from the wallowers, reaching for me, even in the heart of the city. One day, I might have to face it again. Or maybe, it will find me first. I just hope that when that day comes, I'll be ready. I hope that Clara, my job, my new life, will be enough to anchor me to this world, to keep me from answering the call of the mountain, the call of the darkness that waits beneath. My name is Ben Carter, and I was 65 when this whole nightmare went down. It happened in the thick of the Umpqua National Forest in Oregon. I figured I'd go out there, find some peace and quiet, you know. Instead, I found something that still messes with my head to this day. It all started in early spring, when the forest was just waking up from its winter nap. Air was crisp, smelled like pine needles and damp earth, that kind of thing. My old RV, a beat up beast I called, the Wanderer, was parked near this little clearing I'd found while poring over some old forest maps. I really thought it was the perfect spot. This whole trip was supposed to be my escape. An escape from a world I just didn't get anymore. A place to clear my head and deal with the guilt I'd been carrying around for decades. Guilt over my younger brother, Sam. He died when I was 28 in a car crash. A stupid, pointless car crash. I've replayed it a million times in my head. Could I have stopped it? Should I have done something differently? Those questions, they just eat you up inside. I thought maybe the wilderness, with all its quiet, and its, I don't know, its bigness, maybe it would have some answers. But the forest, it had other ideas. The first few days were alright, actually pretty nice. I spent my time hiking, chopping wood for the fire, just sitting by the creek that ran behind my campsite. The days were fine, it was the nights that were rough. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, you know? Like it was pressing down on you. And then there was the glade. The glade was about a mile west of my camp. A weird little clearing I stumbled on during one of my hikes. The trees around it were all gnarled and ancient looking, their branches reaching up like these bony, skeletal fingers. No birds sang there, and the usual rustling sounds of the forest, they just seemed muted. The whole place felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. But I just brushed it off. I'd read stories about places like this, natural oddities that people like to make into a big spooky deal. I even laughed at myself as I practically ran back to camp that first time, heart pounding like crazy for no reason I could put my finger on. That next night, the dream started. Sam was there, standing by the edge of the glade. He looked just like I remembered him. The day he died, bride, laughing. He was calling my name, waving me over. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing like a drum. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just your imagination running wild from being alone out here. But deep down, I knew it was something more. On the fourth day, the Wanderer decided to give up the ghost. The engine just wouldn't start. I was planning on driving into the nearest town, Oakhurst, for supplies, but the old girl just coughed, sputtered, and died. I checked under the hood and found the battery all corroded and the wiring chewed up, probably by some damn rodents. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, so I didn't panic. Not yet, anyway. Instead, I tried my shortwave radio. Figured I'd call for help. but all I got was static on every channel. That's when the unease started to creep in, like a cold draft under a door. And then the storm rolled in that evening, a real monster. It trapped me in the RV, wind howling like a banshee, and rain pounding on the thin metal walls like it was trying to get in. The next morning, I went out to check the damage. The storm had flooded the whole area, and the dirt roads leading to my campsite were completely washed out. It would take days for it to dry, maybe even longer. My supplies were getting low, but I figured I could stretch them if I rationed things out. I wasn't too worried, just annoyed. But then I saw them, the footprints. They were faint, but definitely there, pressed into the soft ground near my campfire. Too big to be mine, too small to be a bear. I tried to convince myself they were old, maybe left by some hiker before the storm. But something about them felt off. They were heading in one direction, toward the glade. I told myself I wasn't going back there, that I'd be an idiot to even think about it. But by the 7th day, being stuck there with no food, no way out, and my mind starting to play tricks on me. Well, let's just say curiosity and plain old desperation got the better of me. I packed a small bag with some water, a flashlight, and my hunting knife, and set out for the clearing. The forest felt different this time. Alive, almost, like the trees were watching me. The air got colder the closer I got, and when I finally stepped into the glade, I was hit by this unnatural stillness. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the whole world. And then I saw it, the bonfire. It was burning bright and hot in the center of the clearing, even though there wasn't any wood feeding the flames. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the fire like an idiot. Then I heard his voice. "Ben, over here." It was Sam. He was standing on the other side of the fire, his face lit up by the flickering light. I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He smiled, but it wasn't Sam's smile. It wasn't warm or familiar. It was wrong, twisted somehow. "You shouldn't have come here, Ben," he said. What is this?" I finally managed to choke out. His expression darkened. "You know what this is. You've always known." That's when I ran. I turned and ran as fast as my old legs could carry me, the sound of his laughter echoing behind me, all the way back to camp. That night, the whispers started. They were coming from outside the RV, circling it like a pack of hungry wolves. Sometimes it was Sam's voice. Other times it was something else, something I couldn't understand, something that made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep a wink. By the 10th day, I was coming apart at the seams. My supplies were gone, and I hadn't seen another living soul since I'd arrived. The whispers were constant now, and I started seeing things. Shadows flickering in the corners of my vision. Then, when I was at my absolute lowest, when I thought I was going to lose my mind completely, Sarah showed up. At first, I thought she was just another hallucination. "Ben," she called out, her voice cutting through the fog in my brain. "What the hell are you still doing here?" But she was real. I ran to her, practically babbling about the glade, the fire, about Sam. Her eyes narrowed as she listened, and when I was finished, she grabbed my shoulders hard. "You need to leave, Ben." "Now, I can't," I said, my voice cracking. "The roads are washed out, and the RV." She cut me off. "There's a ranger station a few miles east of here. We'll go there on foot. Pack whatever you can carry." But it was already too late. That night, as Sarah and I were getting ready to leave, packing what little we could carry. That's when it happened. The glade, it came to us. The bonfire, that same unnatural, flickering fire, appeared right outside my RV. Shadows moved within it, twisting and writhing like they were alive. It was like something out of a nightmare, and we were trapped right in the middle of it. Sarah cursed under her breath, pulling out her flashlight and a gun from her pack. A gun. I hadn't even thought of bringing a gun. I guess I'm not cut out for this wilderness stuff, after all. Stay behind me, she ordered, her voice tight with a fear that mirrored my own. But the shadows, they didn't just stay outside. They started seeping through the walls, filling the RV with this cold, suffocating presence. It felt like the air was being sucked out of my lungs. Sarah fired her gun, the sound deafening in the small space, but it didn't do a damn thing. The shadows kept coming, closing in, and I felt something cold, something incredibly old and sharp, slice across my leg. I screamed, falling to the floor, the pain searing through me. Sarah grabbed me, dragging me out of the RV and into the night. We ran, blindly, into the forest, the shadows hot on our heels. I don't remember how long we ran, or even where we were going. All I remember is the terror, the burning in my leg, and the feeling that something ancient and evil was chasing us. And then I was alone. I don't know what happened to Sarah. One minute she was there, the next she was gone. I must have passed out from the pain and the fear, because when I woke up, hours later, I was alone bleeding, and the forest was silent again. The shadows were gone, the bonfire was gone, but the terror, that stayed with me. I managed to drag myself, inch by agonizing inch, to the ranger station. It took me what felt like a lifetime, but I finally made it. I was found by a search party the next day, half dead and delirious. They never found Sarah, not a trace, and nobody believed my story about the glade. They said it was just hallucinations, brought on by isolation, starvation, and probably a healthy dose of good old-fashioned guilt. They said I was just an old man who'd lost his way in the woods, both literally and figuratively. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. The glade is real. That fire, those shadows, they're real. And Sam, that thing that looked like Sam, that wasn't him. Not really. It was something else, something that had taken his form, his voice, to lure me in. They can call me crazy, they can lock me up. It doesn't matter. I know what happened in those woods. I know that something evil is out there, in that glade, waiting for someone else to stumble into its trap. Someone else looking for peace, for answers, just like I was. And the worst part is, I know I'll never really escape it. I'll carry it with me. That terror, that cold, that feeling of absolute dread, for the rest of my days. It's a part of me now, just like the guilt over Sam. Just like the scar on my leg, a constant reminder of the nightmare in the Umpqua National Forest. So, if you ever find yourself out there, in that beautiful, terrible wilderness, and you see a clearing, a place where the trees are twisted, and the air is still, and you feel that little shiver down your spine, turn around. Run. Don't look back. Don't try to find answers in the darkness, because sometimes the answers find you. And trust me, you don't want to meet them. You don't want to end up like me, or like Sarah, lost and forgotten in the heart of the woods, haunted by something you can't explain, something you can't escape. Just don't go there. The glade is waiting, and it's always hungry. My name is Jack Riley, and I'm 46 years young. Let me tell you, when this all went down, it was late October. The kind of weather where the chill starts to seep into your bones, you know, and you suddenly realize just how damn far you are from civilization. I'd parked my beat-up old camper, a trusty Winnebago I call the Wanderer, deep in the Umpqua National Forest, near a place called Devil's Knob. It's remote, ruggedly beautiful, and quiet as a tomb. Just what I needed. See, my wife, Sarah, passed away about 6 months before, and the house back in Eugene, Oregon, felt like a mausoleum, full of ghosts and memories. I was desperate to escape, to breathe again. I figured out here, surrounded by those towering Douglas firs and the whisper of the leaves, I could do just that. The first day was, well, it was perfect. I spent my time hiking the shorter trails, gathering firewood, you know, the usual outdoorsy stuff. I even found a little clearing where I could set up a campfire and read. It was exactly the kind of solitude I was craving. My camper was parked on this flat patch of dirt, just off an old logging road. No cell service, but I wasn't worried. I had enough supplies for a week, a satellite GPS, and enough survival skills to keep myself from becoming bare food. Or so I thought. The first weird thing happened on the second night. I was sitting by the fire, enjoying the crisp air, when I heard it. This low, guttural growl coming from the trees. At first, I brushed it off. Probably just a bear or coyote, right? The forest is teeming with wildlife, and it's not unusual to hear things go bump in the night. But this sound, it was unsettling, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't like any animal. It was almost human, but wrong. Later, when I stepped away from the firelight, my flashlight beam caught something odd. Carved into the dirt near my campsite were these strange symbols, crude and uneven, like someone had drawn them in a hurry, or maybe they were just shaking like a leaf. They formed a circle, and even though I didn't recognize them, they sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was probably just some kids messing around. Maybe some local teenagers had stumbled upon my campsite earlier and decided to play a prank. But deep down, I wasn't buying it. Not one bit. By the third day, the tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. My camper's solar generator started acting up, the lights flickering like something out of a horror movie. I tried not to overthink it. The generator was old, and it's not like they never act up, right? But then, the next morning, I found these deep scratches along the side of the camper. That's when the panic started to set in. They were long, jagged gouges, way too high up to have been made by any animal I could think of. I tried to scrub them out, to shake off the feeling of dread that was creeping over me. I wasn't about to let paranoia ruin my retreat. Then, I met this park ranger, a woman named Jessica Hayes. She showed up at my site out of the blue. She was maybe in her early 30s, with this no-nonsense vibe and an air of authority that told you not to mess with her. "You shouldn't be out here alone," she said, her eyes scanning my campsite with a wary look. When I asked her why, she hesitated, like she was debating whether or not to tell me. "This area has a history," she finally said. "People disappearing, strange sightings. Most locals avoid it." I laughed it off, nervously, thinking she was just trying to scare me. But the look in her eyes was dead serious. "If you see anything unusual," she said, her voice low, "leave. Don't try to figure it out. Just go." That night, sleep was a distant dream. Every creak of the camper, every whisper of the wind, felt amplified like a threat. Around 2:00 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the fallen leaves. I grabbed the hunting knife I kept by the door, my heart hammering against my ribs, and switched on my flashlight. When I stepped outside, the footsteps stopped. The air was thick with this unnatural stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, hunched over and shrouded in shadow, darted between the trees. It was too fast, too silent, to be human. My blood ran cold. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, gripping my knife, but it was gone. Whatever was. The next morning confirmed my worst fears. I found more of those strange carvings in the dirt, and there was this pile of rocks stacked in a pyramid near my camper. It was clear now that I wasn't alone. But who, or what, was out there remained a mystery. That morning, I made up my mind. I was getting out of there. I packed up my stuff, threw it in the camper, and tried to start the engine. Nothing. It wouldn't turn over. I checked the fuel full tank. The battery was fully charged. There was no logical reason for it not to start. My gut was screaming at me. This was not natural. Over the next 2 days, things went from bad to worse. I rationed my food and water, knowing I couldn't rely on the Wanderer to get me out. Every night, the footsteps returned, closer, bolder. On the 5th night, I woke up to this horrific scraping sound against the camper's metal walls. When I went outside, my flashlight beam revealed deep, fresh scratches running along the entire length of the vehicle. It looked like something had clawed at it in a rage. My firewood pile had been scattered, and there were more of those damn symbols etched into the surrounding trees. By now, fear had completely taken over. Forget reason. I just wanted out. I decided to hike out, to make my way back towards the nearest town, leaving the camper behind. I loaded a backpack with the essentials: water, a map, and my trusty hunting knife. I set off at dawn. The forest was dense, disorienting. And as the hours passed, I realized I wasn't making any progress. The landmarks I'd been following seemed to shift and change, like the forest was playing tricks on me. And my GPS completely dead, useless. That's when I found it, the campsite. It was abandoned, like someone had left in a hurry. A torn tent, scattered belongings, a scene of chaos. Among the debris, I found a journal. The entries were frantic, disjointed, detailing the writer's descent into paranoia. "Thee watch from the trees." One entry read, "Thee whisper my name." The final entry was a single word, scrawled across the page, "Owen." As I stood there, the forest fell eerily silent. Then I heard it again, that low, guttural growl, impossibly close this time. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, just like the journal said. The trees blurred past as I stumbled through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs burning. But I didn't stop, not until I reached a clearing. I collapsed there, trembling, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum. When I finally made my way back to the camper, it was nearly dark. The vehicle was trashed. The windows were shattered. The interior had been ransacked. And worse, I found blood smeared on the driver's seat. I didn't know whose it was, but I knew I had to get out of there. I tried the engine one last time, and to my utter shock, it roared to life. I didn't question it. I didn't even try to understand it. I just threw the camper into gear and drove like a bat out of hell. the headlights cutting through the endless darkness of the forest. I made it to the nearest town the following morning, exhausted, shaken, looking like I'd just wrestled a bear and lost. When I told my story to the authorities, they dismissed it, said it was a case of paranoia brought on by isolation. But I know what I saw. The scratches, the carvings, that figure in the woods, they were real. And whoever, or whatever, was out there, it wasn't human. A week later, Ranger Jessica Hayes reached out to me. She said another camper had gone missing in the same area. Their abandoned campsite was found, eerily similar to mine. Her voice was laced with fear, and for the first time, I saw that tough ranger's mask slip. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "And you know what? I couldn't argue with that. I was lucky. And I don't think I'll ever forget what happened to me out there in the Umpqua National Forest. It's a place of beauty, sure, but there's something else out there, something dark and ancient, and it's best left alone. I learned that the hard way. I got out, but a part of me is still there in the dark, under those towering trees, listening for those footsteps in the night." Alright, so let me tell you about the time our family vacation turned into a straight up nightmare. My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 38. And this whole mess happened in the let's call them the Serpent's Tooth Mountains in Oregon. It was supposed to be this amazing week-long getaway, you know. A chance to unplug and reconnect. My husband David, he's 40. A history teacher, loves the past. Totally clueless about the present. Bless his heart. And our daughter Chloe was 6 at the time, full of beans and always asking why. I had it all planned out, a total digital detox, just us and nature. Yeah, right. It ended up being the most terrifying experience of my life. We rented this old RV, the Wanderer. David called it. He thought it would be charming. I wasn't sold, but hey, it had been a while since we'd done anything like this as a family, and I wanted to make it special for Chloe. The drive up to the mountains was pretty uneventful, though I did start to realize just how bad David was at packing when he announced he forgot a paper map. We were relying on the GPS in his phone, which kept cutting out. "Don't worry," he said. "I've got a great sense of direction." I rolled my eyes, but kept quiet. We finally got to our campsite as the sun was setting. It was this secluded little clearing, surrounded by these massive pine trees that seemed to scrape the sky, and these jagged, pointy peaks that looked like, well, teeth. Hence the name I gave the mountains. It was beautiful, sure, but even then, something felt off. The first couple of days were okay. Chloe was in heaven, chasing butterflies and picking wildflowers. David kept her entertained with stories about the pioneers who used to travel through these parts. But me, I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched. The forest was too quiet, like dead quiet. And the air, it always felt cold, even when the sun was shining. At night, I'd lie awake in that creaky old RV, listening to every little noise. The wind whistling through the trees, the rustling in the bushes. It all sounded amplified, somehow. David just said I was being paranoid. Then, on the third day, things went sideways. We were setting up lunch by the fire pit, hot dogs, because what's a camping trip without them? And Chloe wandered off. It wasn't a big deal at first. She liked to explore, and we told her not to go too far. But after 20 minutes, she wasn't back. That's when the panic started to set in. David and I started calling her name, our voices echoing through the trees like desperate pleas. Finally, we found her. She was in this small clearing, just sitting there, staring at this circle of rocks. They were arranged in this weird, deliberate pattern, almost like a miniature Stonehenge. And Chloe, she was whispering to them. Seriously, what are you doing, sweetie? I asked, my voice trembling. She just looked at me and said, talking to the lady. What lady? I pressed, my heart pounding in my chest. She lives in the rocks, Chloe replied, pointing at the circle. She's nice. David laughed it off, called it a kid's imagination. But I felt a chill, like someone had poured ice water down my spine. I told Chloe not to wander off again, and we went back to the campsite. That night I heard it, laughter. Faint, high-pitched, like a child's, but twisted, distorted. It made my skin crawl. David swore it was just the wind, but I knew better. The air was also different. It smelled like wet dirt and something else. Something sickly sweet, like rotting flowers. I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, we found them, claw marks. Deep, jagged gashes on the side of the RV, like something had tried to rip its way in. Probably just a bear, David said, but he didn't sound so sure anymore. I mean, why would a bear attack an RV? I wanted to leave, to get out of there, but David insisted it was all part of the wilderness experience. He promised to keep a closer eye on Chloe and spent the rest of the day trying to fix the stove, which of course had broken down the night before. Later that day, on one of our hikes, we stumbled upon this cabin, abandoned, creepy as hell. The roof was caved in, the windows were shattered, and the whole thing looked like it was about to collapse. Chloe clutched my hand so tightly it hurt. Inside it was even worse. Jars filled with these dried up, shriveled herbs, and carvings on the walls. Faces, twisted, agonized faces with hollow eyes that seemed to follow us. And the smell. Oh God, the smell. It was like a mix of mildew, dust, and that same sickly sweet scent from the night before, only stronger. Chloe tugged on my arm, her little voice barely a whisper. She's watching us, Mommy. David tried to make a joke, but I could see the fear in his eyes now, too. We got out of there fast. But all the way back to the campsite, Chloe kept looking over her shoulder, like she expected to see someone or something following us. That night, the whispers came. Louder this time, more insistent. I barely slept, tossing and turning, every nerve on edge. The forest outside seemed to press against the thin walls of the RV, a living, breathing entity. On the 5th day, the RV wouldn't start. Dead, David spent hours under the hood, cursing and banging around, but it was no use, and, of course, there was no cell service. We were trapped. That night, Chloe woke me up, crying. She said the laddie had been in her dreams, telling her we couldn't leave, that the lady needed us to stay. I held Chloe tight, my mind racing. What had we gotten ourselves into? David still refused to believe anything supernatural was going on. He kept saying it was just stress and exhaustion playing tricks on us. But I could tell he was scared too. We were all scared. The scratches on the RV were deeper now, more pronounced, and the whispers outside had turned into voices. Multiple voices, murmuring in a language I didn't understand, a guttural, unsettling tongue that seemed to vibrate in the air around us. The 6th day was the day Chloe disappeared. I'll never forget that feeling. That hollow, gut-wrenching terror that ripped through me when I realized she was gone. David and I searched everywhere. screaming her name until our throats were raw, our voices hoarse echoes in the oppressive silence of the woods. We finally found her, near that damn cabin, standing inside the circle of rocks. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, and her lips were moving, but no sound came out. It was like she was in a trance. When I grabbed her, she seemed to snap out of it. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, and said, "She's angry. She doesn't want us to leave." That was it. I knew we had to do something. We had to destroy whatever was holding her, holding us, to this place. David and I gathered wood, anything that would burn. We even siphoned gas from the RV. We went back to that cabin, and we set it on fire. As the flames engulfed the structure, the whole forest seemed to come alive. The wind howled like a banshee, whipping the fire into a frenzy. Shadows danced in the flames, taking on shapes that looked almost human, twisting and contorting in the inferno. And the screams. It wasn't just the crackling of the fire. We heard screams coming from the woods, from all around us, a chorus of inhuman wails that chilled me to the bone. The sickly sweet smell intensified, becoming almost unbearable, mixed with the acrid smell of the smoke. I held Chloe close, praying we'd done the right thing. When we got back to the RV, the engine turned over on the first try. A miracle, maybe. Or maybe something else. David didn't question it. Neither did I. We just drove. We drove as fast as that old RV could go, leaving that burning cabin, that cursed forest, behind us. Chloe hasn't spoken about the lady since, but she's different now, quieter, more withdrawn. And sometimes, late at night, I catch her staring at nothing, her lips moving silently, like she's talking to someone I can't see. We've been back home for a couple of weeks now, but I don't know what we brought back with us. I just know I'm terrified it's not over. A week after we got home, I found a drawing tucked under Chloe's pillow. It was a picture of that lady, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a crooked, unsettling smile. Behind her stood three figures, a man, a woman, and a little girl. They were standing in the forest, and they looked just like us. David said it was nothing, just her imagination running wild after a scary experience. But I can't shake the feeling that it's more than that. That we didn't escape. That we just brought the nightmare home with us. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and the wind is howling outside, I think I can still hear them, those whispers, just beyond the edge of hearing, calling to us from the shadows. And I know, deep down, that we'll never truly be free of the Serpent's Tooth Mountains. Alright, let me tell you about the time I, Sarah Jenkins, was 31 and thought I had it all figured out. This was back when my boyfriend, Mark Collins, who was 34 at the time, and I decided to ditch the city and live out our wilderness fantasy. We'd been planning this off-grid adventure in Deschutes National Forest in Oregon for months. We were so sick of the rat race, the noise, the constant grind. We craved that deep connection with nature, you know. Plus, we wanted to prove to ourselves that we were tough, that we could handle anything. We had this RV, all decked out, plus a bunch of survival gear, and each other. That's all we needed, right? The forest was, well, it was something else. Huge pine trees, like skyscrapers, their needles whispering secrets in the wind. The air was crisp and clean, smelling like damp earth and moss, and that amazing wood smoke scent. It was beautiful, seriously, postcard, perfect, but it was also kind of intense. like the whole place was watching us. Mark called it our little pocket of paradise. We parked the RV in this secluded clearing, miles off one of those Forest Service roads, far from any marked campsite. Those first few days were pure bliss. We fished in this crystal clear stream, built a fire pit from rocks we found, and spent hours just talking under the blanket of stars. Mark's one of those eternally optimistic, adventurous types, and honestly, his energy was contagious. I felt myself unwinding for the first time in years. But, you know how it goes. By day 3, things started to get a little weird. Our solar panel, the one that was supposed to power the RV, decided to take a vacation. Mark spent hours messing with it, trying to get it to work, while I was freaking out, trying to ration the power we had left. He kept saying, "It's no big deal, we'll figure it out." But without power, the fridge was useless, our food was at risk of spoiling, and the water pump was barely a trickle. We were burning through our firewood way faster than we planned, too, because the nights were way colder than we expected. Then, on the 4th evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees, we heard it. Laughter. It echoed through the woods, carried on the wind, like some kind of creepy lullaby. I froze, a bundle of kindling in my arms. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mark, trying to keep my voice steady. He stopped what he was doing, listened for a second, and then shook his head. "Probably just the wind, or maybe another camper," he said, but I could see he was a bit tense, even though he tried to play it cool. We both knew there shouldn't have been anyone else out there. We were in the middle of nowhere. Still, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The forest can play tricks on you, right? The next day, Mark found the knife. He went out early to gather more firewood while I boiled water for breakfast on our portable stove. When he came back, he had this old, rusty blade in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. The note was tied to the knife's handle with twine, and it just had 2 words scrawled on it. Levanou. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice definitely not steady anymore. Mark shrugged, trying to downplay it, of course. "Probably just some stupid joke," he said. "Maybe a hunter left it out here or something." But this was far from any road. This far from the road. I pressed, feeling a knot of dread in my stomach. He didn't have an answer for that. He just tossed the knife into the fire pit and shoved the note in his pocket. "We are not leaving just because someone's trying to scare us," he said, all tough guy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. That night, the laughter came back. This time, it was louder, clearer. It definitely wasn't the wind. It sounded human. Playful, but also kind of sinister, like kids giggling just out of sight. We stayed inside the RV, with all the lights off, listening as it got closer, and then faded away again. Mark didn't say anything, but I saw the way his jaw was clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. The next morning, our stream, the one we'd been drinking from, smelled like sulfur. I tried boiling it, but it tasted disgusting, metallic and bitter. We had to switch to our emergency water bottles, but I knew they wouldn't last forever. The final straw, the thing that really pushed us over the edge, was when we met the man in the woods. It was late afternoon, and Mark and I were having it out, arguing about whether we should stay or go. I was all for packing up and finding a new spot, somewhere, anywhere but here. He was still insisting it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid. Then, this voice cut through our bickering like a knife. "You shouldn't be here." We both spun around. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was this guy. He was older, with a face like tanned leather and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in a month. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and he was staring at us with these intense eyes that made my skin crawl. "This land's no good for camping," he said, his voice rough. "Best pack up and head back to town." Mark, being Mark, stepped forward, all defensive. "We're fine here, thanks for the concern," he said, trying to sound tough. The man's expression darkened. "You think this is a joke," he said. "People like you come out here, think it's all peace and quiet. But there's things in these woods you don't understand." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of things?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He just turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as he'd appeared. That night, the laughter turned to screams. Piercing, blood-curdling screams that echoed all around us. We huddled inside the RV, armed with a hatchet and a hunting knife, scared out of our minds. The whole RV shook as something heavy slammed against the side. Then another side. It was like whatever it was circling us, pounding and scratching all through the night. It didn't stop until dawn. When the sun finally came up, we cautiously stepped outside. The RV had these deep gashes in the metal siding, and there were these strange symbols burned into the ground all around it. Mark's bravado was gone. He looked pale, shaken. "We need to leave," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now?" We packed up in a frenzy. But when Mark tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. It was like the battery was completely dead, even though we'd checked it just the day before. We were stranded. Desperate, we decided to hike back to the road, leaving most of our stuff behind. The forest felt different as we walked. The trees seemed closer, their branches all tangled up overhead, blocking out the sunlight. The air was heavy, making it hard to breathe. Every snap of a twig made us jump. Then, about halfway to the road, we found the cabin. It was old, falling apart, with broken windows and the door hanging open. Against my better judgment, we went inside, hoping to find something, anything, that could help us. What we found were more of those strange symbols, carved into the walls and painted in what looked like dried blood. In the corner of the room, there was this bundle of twigs and bones, tied together with a strip of cloth. It looked like some kind of creepy, homemade doll. Mark backed away, his face ashen. "We need to go. Now," he said, his voice urgent. We ran the rest of the way to the road, not stopping until we reached the highway. A trucker, bless his heart, picked us up, and we didn't look back. Days later, when we finally went back with a tow truck to get the RV, it was gone. Vanished. The clearing looked untouched, like we'd never even been there. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in Deschutes National Forest. Was it a prank? Some locals messing with us? Was it something else? Something supernatural? All I know is that I'll never go back there. And I'll never, ever forget the sound of that laughter, echoing in the dark. That will be with me forever. My name is Ethan Hayes, and I was 51 years old when my life took a turn for the worse. It was the fall of 2023, late October. You know that feeling when the air gets so crisp it feels like you could snap it in half. That's how it was around Crater Lake. The trees seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for winter. I'd taken my beat up old RV, a 1987 Fleetwood Bounder that I affectionately called the Wanderer, out to the park. It wasn't a vacation, not really. It was an escape. See, life had pretty much kicked me to the curb. My wife, Mary, had passed away from cancer 6 months earlier. Our house, once filled with laughter and the smell of her amazing cooking, now just echoed with her absence. Every room was a painful reminder of what I'd lost. I was drowning in grief. I needed silence, or maybe a different kind of silence, the kind you only find out in the middle of nowhere. That's why I picked Crater Lake. It was remote, desolate even. A perfect place to be alone with my thoughts, to try and figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. I parked the Wanderer in one of the less popular campgrounds near Rim Drive, far away from the main entrance. It was the middle of the week, so the place was practically a ghost town, just the way I liked it. The first few days were uneventful. I kept busy tinkering with the RV, fixing little things that were always breaking down. I also took some long walks around the trails. Crater Lake it's something else. It's the kind of place that feels ancient, you know, like it's been there forever, watching, waiting. The water is this crazy shade of blue, so deep it looks like it's hiding something. Even though I was a mess, I felt a little bit of peace out there. That peace lasted until the third night. That night, the temperature dropped like a rock. It went below freezing, and of course, the Wanderer's heater decided to die. Not that I was surprised. The thing was older than I was, and had been on its last legs for years. I bundled up in my sleeping bag, tried to tough it out, but the cold just seeped into my bones. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. 3 sharp knocks on the door. Knock, knock. My blood turned to ice. Nobody was supposed to be out here. The nearest campers were at least a quarter mile away. I grabbed the flashlight I kept next to my bed and called out, "Who's there?" No answer. Just the wind moaning through the pine trees outside. Finally, I worked up the courage to open the door. There was no one there. But on the window, there was frost. And it wasn't just regular frost. It was in these weird, angular patterns, almost like those runes you see in old books. It definitely hadn't been there when I fell asleep. I rubbed it off with my hand. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake this feeling of dread. The next day, I hiked to the visitor center to report what happened. I talked to Ranger Emily Carter, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. I told her about the knocking and the frost. She listened politely, but I could tell she wasn't taking me seriously. Probably just some teenagers messing around, she said, though her eyes didn't quite agree with her words. But I'll keep an eye out. I spent the rest of the day gathering firewood and trying to fix the heater, which was a lost cause. As I worked, I started to notice things. The forest seemed different. The birds were quieter. The air felt heavy, like it was carrying more than just the usual pine scent. It was probably just my nerves, I told myself. But then I found the bones. About 50 yards from my RV, just off the trail, there was a small clearing. And in the center of that clearing, there was a pile of animal bones, arranged in a spiral. They weren't old bones, either. Some of them still had bits of flesh and fur clinging to them. It was like a scene out of a horror movie. A chill went down my spine, and it had nothing to do with the cold. That evening, As I was chopping firewood, a man appeared at the edge of my campsite. He looked like he'd been living in the woods for years. Weary, disheveled, with wild eyes and a tangled beard. He was wearing this filthy old parka that looked like it had seen better decades. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and rough. "Excuse me," I said, gripping the axe tighter. "They're waking up," he muttered, ignoring me. "You're disturbing them." "Who are you talking about?" I asked, but he just shook his head and walked away, disappearing into the woods before I could get another word out of him. I thought about reporting him to Ranger Carter, but I decided against it. He seemed more lost than dangerous. That night, the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. Begin. I didn't open the door. I peered out through the frost-covered window. The patterns were back, but this time, they were glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. And beyond the frost, out there in the darkness of the woods, I saw them. Shadows. Dozens of them. They were moving, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. It was like they were floating just above the ground, gliding through the trees. I locked the door and sat there, clutching my hunting knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. The shadows pressed closer, their forms indistinct but definitely human-shaped. They didn't make a sound, but I could hear this low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. I prayed for morning to come. Eventually, as the first rays of dawn started to peek through the trees, the shadows faded away. When Ranger Carter came, by the next morning, to check on me, I told her everything. About the shadows, the humming, everything. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head, but she promised to patrol the area that night. I didn't tell her about the glowing symbols on the window, though. Even I knew how crazy that sounded. I was starting to wonder if I was going crazy. As the day wore on, the tension in the air got thicker. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I decided to hike back to the clearing where I'd found the bones, hoping to find some kind of explanation, something to make sense of it all. But when I got there, the bones were gone, vanished. In their place was this thing, a crude effigy made of sticks and animal hides, hanging from a tree. It looked like a person, but all twisted and wrong. The arms were too long, the head was too small. It was the creepiest thing I'd ever seen. I stumbled back to the Wanderer, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. When I got back to the RV, I found the strange man from before sitting on the steps. He didn't even look up as I approached. "They're not going to let you leave," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "Who?" I demanded. "What are you talking about?" "The ones in the woods," he said, finally looking at me. "The old ones. They've been here long before us, and they don't take kindly to trespassers." Before I could respond, he stood up and walked away, melting back into the forest like he was a part of it. That night, Ranger Carter didn't come back. I waited for hours, but there was no sign of her. And the shadows, they were back, and this time they were bolder. They swarmed around the Wanderer, pressing against the sides, leaving streaks of frost wherever they touched. And the whispers. I could hear whispers now, faint but insistent. They were speaking in a language I didn't understand, but it made my skin crawl. At some point, I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, it was to the sound of shattering glass. The RV's windows were broken, and everything inside was covered in a layer of frost. and then I saw her. Ranger Carter's body was lying just outside the door. Her face was frozen in a mask of pure terror. Her throat had been slit, but there wasn't any blood. Just ice. I didn't have time to mourn. The shadows were still out there, watching. I could feel them. I grabbed my knife and flashlight and just started running. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get out of there. The forest seemed to twist and turn around me, the trees growing denser, more oppressive. The whispers grew louder, and the air got so cold it burned my lungs. I felt like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing and collapsed. When I looked up, I saw him, the man from the woods. He was standing over me, looking down with those same unsettling eyes. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said. "Now, it's too late." I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital in Medford. A group of hikers had found me unconscious near the park boundary. They said I was mumbling about shadows and runes. I was in pretty bad shape, they told me. Ranger Carter's body was never found. The park rangers wrote her disappearance off as a tragic accident, a fall or something. As for the man, the one who'd warned me, nobody else had seen him. The rangers insisted there was no record of anyone living illegally in the park. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know I'll never go back to Crater Lake again. That place, it's not right. There's something dark there. Something ancient and malevolent. Something that doesn't want to be disturbed. And me, I disturbed it. I'm just lucky to be alive. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I can still hear those whispers. And I know, deep down, that a part of me is still trapped in that frozen forest, running from the shadows that never sleep. And I wonder if, like Ranger Carter, a part of me will be trapped there forever. They never did find her, you know. Just like they'll never find what's really out there, hiding in the deep blue of Crater Lake. My name is Chloe Carter, and I'm 29 years old. What happened to me? It all went down last summer of 2023, at Crater Lake National Park in Oregon. I swear, I didn't plan on being there alone. My best friend, Jessica, was supposed to come with me, but she bailed at the last minute. "Family emergency," she said. I could have cancelled the whole damn trip, but honestly, I needed to be alone. I was desperate for some solitude. After losing my little brother, Alex, in a car wreck 2 years ago, I'd become this restless soul. My job as a graphic designer, my friends, my whole routine. It all felt meaningless. Like I was just going through the motions. I figured some time alone in nature might do me some good. Maybe clear my head, give me some kind of clarity, you know? So, I loaded up my beat, up old Jeep Cherokee, with all my camping gear, and drove to Crater Lake. I was planning to spend a week hiking and camping near the lake's edge. The drive up was breathtaking. Seriously. The kind of scenery that makes you forget all your problems. Thick, dense forests would suddenly open up, and you'd get these glimpses of the deep blue lake. I'm talking the kind of blue that looks totally fake in pictures. It's unreal. I stopped at the visitor center to check in and grab a map. And that's where I met this guy, a hunter named Rick Hayes. He was a real rough around the edges kind of dude, with a beard that looked like it hadn't seen a pair of scissors in a decade, and a rifle slung over his shoulder like he was expecting trouble. "Camping alone, huh?" he asked, his voice somewhere between amused and concerned. "Yeah," I replied. "Why?" He just shrugged. "Strange things happen out here sometimes. Weird animal behavior, people hearing things that, well, they don't make a lick of sense. Just be careful out there." I kinda laughed it off, but his words, they stuck with me as I drove to the trailhead. A little knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I set up camp a few miles from the parking lot, on this secluded ridge overlooking the lake. The first 2 days were pretty uneventful, in the best way possible. I hiked, I wrote in my journal, and at night, I sat by the fire, just letting the sounds of the forest wash over me. It felt amazing, like, with every breath of fresh air, I was shedding another layer of all the anxiety and crap I'd been carrying around. It was the third night when I heard it. This low, guttural growl. It was so faint, I almost thought I was imagining it. I sat straight up in my tent, straining to hear. Then it came again. Closer this time. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and fumbled with the zipper of the tent. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, catching nothing but shadows. "Probably just a coyote," I muttered to myself, trying to sound braver than I felt. But let me tell you, I slept with my camping knife tucked under my pillow that night. The next morning, I found them, claw marks, gouged deep into a tree near my campsite. Deep, jagged scratches that definitely didn't look like anything a coyote could make. I told myself it was probably a bear. I mean, there are plenty of those in the area. Still, a shiver of fear ran down my spine. I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. Despite the unease, I packed a small day bag and decided to go explore. Around noon, I stumbled upon this cave near the lake's edge. It wasn't marked on any of the maps and, well, curiosity killed the cat, right? Inside, the air was cool and damp, but there was this smell, this awful coppery smell that made my stomach churn. I turned a corner, and I nearly screamed. Bones, dozens of them, scattered all over the floor. Some were definitely deer bones, but others, I wasn't so sure. They looked disturbingly human. I backed out of that cave so fast, my heart hammering against my ribs. I told myself I'd report it to the rangers when I got back, but a part of me doubted they'd even believe me. I mean, who would? That night, the noises came again. Growls, heavy breathing, and this sickening scraping sound, like nails on wood. I stayed huddled in my tent, clutching my knife, trying to tell myself it was just an animal, just my imagination running wild. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek outside, the faint moonlight illuminated them. Footprints. They were huge, almost human-shaped, but with these wicked-looking clawed toes. And they were circling my tent. That was it. Panic seized me. I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up my gear at dawn, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fold my tent. I decided to hike back to my Jeep. I just needed to leave. But the trail, it felt wrong. Like I was in some kind of twisted funhouse mirror. Landmarks I'd passed before weren't where I remembered them. The trees seemed to be closing in, crowding me, blocking out the sunlight. Hours passed, and the awful realization hit me. I was lost. Hopelessly, terrifyingly lost. Then, through the trees, I saw it. Smoke. Relief washed over me, so intense it almost brought me to my knees. I stumbled towards it, praying it was another camper. And it was. I practically fell into the campsite, and who did I see? Rick Hayes. Doctor? Thank God. I gasped, breathless. I need help. I'm lost, and I heard I saw these things. But Rick wasn't there, or at least, he wasn't among the living anymore. His tent was slashed open, his gear scattered everywhere. And the blood, oh God, the blood. It stained the ground, smeared in these wide, desperate streaks, like he'd tried to crawl away. His rifle lay abandoned near the fire pit, a bullet still chambered. The growl came again, louder this time, closer, and I felt it before I saw it. Something was watching me. I grabbed the rifle, my fingers clumsy and numb with fear. The trees around me seemed to come alive, shadows darting just beyond my vision. And then I saw it. It stepped into the clearing, massive and hunched, with these glowing amber eyes that burned like fire. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its face was like some horrific mix of a wolf and a man. It snarled, baring teeth that gleamed in the fading light, long and sharp like a wild animal's. Without even thinking, I fired the rifle. The sound was deafening in the quiet forest, the recoil slamming against my shoulder. The bullet hit the creature in the shoulder, and it let out this howl, a sound so unearthly, so filled with rage and pain, that it made my blood run cold. It charged, and I ran. I ran like hell, the rifle heavy and awkward in my hands, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I didn't stop until I found that cave again, the one with the bones. Desperation is a powerful motivator. I had this crazy idea. I remembered seeing a small bundle of dynamite in Rick's bag, probably for blasting game trails or something. I placed the dynamite near the cave entrance, lit the fuse, and ran like my life depended on it. The explosion rocked the ground, sending a plume of dirt and debris high into the air. When the dust finally settled, the cave entrance was gone, sealed shut beneath tons of rock. I collapsed nearby, my body shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face. The forest was silent again, but I couldn't stop listening, waiting for the sound of growls or heavy footsteps. When I finally made it to the ranger station the next day, I was a complete wreck. I told them everything, every single detail. The growls, the footprints, the bones in the cave, the creature Rick, everything. Of course, they didn't believe me. Not one bit. They said Rick was probably attacked by a bear, a common enough occurrence, though usually not fatal. They figured I must have been hallucinating from dehydration or stress. Classic, right? Blame the hysterical woman. But I know what I saw. I know it wasn't a bear. They sent out a search party, naturally. It took them a few days, but they eventually found Rick's body, or what was left of it. Mauled, they said. Animal attack. Case closed. As for the cave, they explored the area where I said it was. The explosion, of course, had covered my tracks. The lead ranger told me that there were no caves in the area matching my description. He said that I must have been mistaken in my panic, and the dynamite had simply caused a small landslide. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake them until they understood. But what was the point? They'd already made up their minds. I left Crater Lake as soon as I could. Drove straight back home to Portland without stopping, except for gas and coffee. The whole way back, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing chasing me. It was irrational, I know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, that it was hunting me. Back in my tiny apartment, I tried to return to normal life, but normal felt a million miles away. I couldn't sleep. Every little creak of the building, every rustle of leaves outside my window made me jump. I kept seeing those glowing eyes, hearing that guttural growl in my head on repeat. And then, the nightmares started. Vivid, terrifying nightmares of that creature, of running through the forest, of the cave collapsing. But the worst part was the claw marks. The first time I saw them, I thought I was losing my mind. They appeared on my windowsill, deep, jagged scratches, just like the ones I'd seen on that tree back at Crater Lake. I told myself it was just some neighborhood cat, but deep down, I knew. I started researching, spending hours online, digging through obscure websites and forums, looking for anything that could explain what I'd seen. I found stories, legends, really, of similar creatures, of shapeshifters and skinwalkers. Native American legends, mostly from the Pacific Northwest. Tales of creatures that could take the form of both man and beast. Creatures of immense power and savagery. Most people dismiss them as myths, of course, but the more I read, the more convinced I became that what I saw was real. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The claw marks kept appearing, sometimes on my window, sometimes on my door, always at night. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly on edge, waiting for the inevitable. I barely left my apartment, only going out when I absolutely had to. I lost my job. My friends, worried at first, eventually stopped calling. Jessica, bless her heart, tried to reach out, but I pushed her away too. How could I explain to her what was happening? She wouldn't believe me, she wouldn't understand. Just like everyone else, she would have thought that I have lost it. One night, the fear became too much. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag, just a few essentials, and left. I didn't have a plan, not really. I just knew I had to get away. I drove, aimlessly at first, heading east. Away from the coast, away from the forests. I ended up in some small town in the middle of nowhere, a place where nobody knew me, where nobody knew my story. I found a cheap motel, paid cash, and stayed holed up in my room, the curtains drawn, the TV always on. A pathetic attempt to drown out the silence. But even here, hundreds of miles from Crater Lake, I didn't feel safe. I still saw those eyes, glowing in the darkness, still heard that growl, faint but always present. One evening, as the sun began to set, I saw a news report on the TV. A hiker had gone missing near Crater Lake. The details were sparse but familiar. A chill ran down my spine. They wouldn't find him. I knew that much. They would call it an animal attack and try to hush it up. Just like before, just like Rick. That's when it hit me. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't hide. That thing, whatever it was tied to Crater Lake. And it wasn't going to stop. Not until it was finished. Not until it had finished what it came there to do. And somehow, I knew that I was tied to it too. So, here I am. Back in my Jeep, driving back to where it all began. Back to Crater Lake. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't have a plan. Not a good one, anyway. But I know I can't let it keep happening. I can't let it keep taking people. I have to stop it. Even if it's the last thing I do. I owe it to Rick. I owe it to my little brother Alex. I owe it to myself. This time, I won't run. This time, I'll fight. Even if it kills me. Wish me luck. I have a feeling I'm going to need it. A whole hell of a lot of it. My name is Bethany, Beth Miller, and I used to be one of those fearless, nature-loving photographers. You know the type, always chasing the perfect shot, no matter how remote or dangerous the location. Back in December of 2021, when I was 29, I decided Crater Lake National Park was my next adventure. I'd been feeling burnt out, like my creative spark was fading, and figured some time in the wilderness would do me good. I'd hiked and camped in some pretty wild places before, so I thought I knew what I was getting into. Man, was I wrong. This trip, it messed me up. I still can barely talk about it. I rolled into Crater Lake just as a massive snowstorm was hitting. It was the off-season, so the park was basically a ghost town. Perfect, I thought. More solitude for me. I parked my beat up Subaru at the last lot they had open, strapped all my gear to a sled, and started trekking into the back country. The silence out there was immediate. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, broken only by the crunch of my boots in the fresh snow, and the occasional groan of the wind whipping through the pines. The first couple of days were pretty uneventful, just frustrating. The storm made everything a pain in the arse, setting up my tent, cooking, even finding good angles to shoot. But the lake, wow, it was just as breathtaking as everyone says. This massive, frozen mirror reflecting the jagged cliffs and the pale, winter sky. I spent hours trying to capture it, waiting for the light to be just right. Nights were brutal. I'm talking bone, chilling cold. My breath would freeze on the inside of my tent, turning it into this icy, glittering fabric. It wasn't until the third night that things started to get weird. I was camped up near the rim, trying to get some long, exposure shots of the stars. The wind had finally died down, and the silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. That's when I saw them, these faint, flickering lights moving across the far shore. At first, I thought, okay, maybe other campers or park rangers, but the way they moved was just off. They were zigzagging, disappearing and reappearing in different spots. Super erratic. I tried to photograph them, but every shot came out blurry, the lights just smearing into these weird streaks. That night, sleep was impossible. The wind picked up again, howling like a banshee, but underneath it, I swear I could hear footsteps. They were circling my tent, soft crunches in the snow. I held my breath, my hand gripping my flashlight and my knife. Yeah, I always sleep with a knife when I'm out in the middle of nowhere. Call me paranoid. After what felt like hours, I finally got the guts to peek outside. Nothing, no tracks, no movement, just endless white. By morning, I was trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Like you said, isolation does weird things to the mind. Still, I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. While I was packing up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A single set of footprints leading away from my tent. They definitely weren't mine, and they didn't look like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. The strides were too long, the shape too human. My gut told me to get the hell out of there, but I did something stupid. I decided to move camp. I headed further into the back country, toward this ridge I'd scouted earlier. I figured a change of scenery might help. The ridge had an amazing view of the lake and the surrounding forest, but that feeling of being watched, it was still there, clinging to me like the cold. I was trying to get a shot of this snow-covered outcrop when I saw it, a figure, standing way out on the ice. It was too far away to make out any details, but it looked human. I yelled, waved my arms like an idiot, but it didn't move. Just stood there, motionless. I lowered my camera to get a better look, and poofed, it was gone. Vanished. That night was a nightmare. The footsteps were back. louder this time, and they weren't circling. They stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow and deliberate. On the other side of the fabric, I lay there frozen, clutching my knife and flashlight, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I guess I passed out from sheer exhaustion. The next day, I knew I had to get out of there. The photos, the solitude, none of it was worth this. But as I was packing up, I realized I wasn't alone. There were tracks in the snow, leading away from my camp and into the woods. And for some reason, some morbid curiosity, I followed them. The trail led me to this clearing. And that's where I found it, an abandoned campsite. A collapsed tent, a rusted-out stove, and gear scattered everywhere, half buried in the snow. Everything looked ancient, weathered by years of exposure. But here's the creepy part. The snow around the site was undisturbed. It was like no one had been there in years. Then, tucked among the debris, I found a journal. The pages were damp and smudged, but I could make out parts of it. I remember one bit of writing in particular that sent chills down my spine. "Thee come at night. Lights in the trees. Can't leave. Something in the water. Don't look at the lake. Not safe." Another part read, "Always watching. Always it." I was done. That journal was all the confirmation I needed. I scrambled back the way I came, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and that creepy clearing. But the storm had other plans. The snow started coming down thick and fast, erasing my tracks and making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of me. My GPS was freaking out, the signal lost in the swirling white. I stumbled around for hours, the cold seeping into my bones, turning my fingers and toes into numb, useless things. By the time I found shelter under a rocky overhang, I was a mess. I could barely move. I managed to get a small fire going and huddled close, trying to fight off the sleep that felt like it was pulling me under. That's when I saw them again, the lights. Only this time, they were closer, much closer. They bobbed through the trees, surrounding me, getting brighter and more numerous until they converged just beyond the flickering firelight. Then, a figure stepped forward. I couldn't see its face, just a dark silhouette against the glow. It raised its arm, pointing toward the lake. Somehow, I found myself standing, my body moving on its own, as if I were being pulled toward the lake, like I was in a trance. But I stumbled on something, maybe a rock or a root, and fell hard. That broke the spell. I looked up, and the lights were gone. The figure was gone. Just the swirling snow and the dying embers of my fire. I don't remember much after that. A blur of cold and fear. I think I blacked out. The next thing I knew, I was being woken up by voices. A search party found me 2 days later, half frozen and delirious. They said I was lucky to be alive. My right hand was in bad shape, frostbite. They had to amputate. The damage was too severe to save. Even if I was airlifted to a hospital in Bend, Oregon. They found my camera near the lake, the memory card miraculously intact. Most of the photos were what you'd expect, landscapes, some wildlife shots, the usual stuff. But a few were different. Really messed up. There were these blurry images of figures in the trees, their faces pale and distorted. And one, taken near that abandoned campsite, of a man standing out on the ice, his face turned toward the camera. His eyes, I can still see them in my nightmares. They found the owner of the journal, or what was left of him, a few weeks later, He was much further down by the lake, or at least his bones were. He was some hiker that went missing over a decade prior. His name was Samuel Tanner. Authorities said he must have fallen through the ice. I don't do photography anymore. The thought of being alone in the wilderness makes my stomach churn. I moved back to the city, tried to get back to a normal life. But sometimes, late at night, I see lights outside my window, faint and flickering. I tell myself it's just headlights, or a passing plane, or my PTSD playing tricks on my mind. There have been more disappearances around the lake since my incident. I've been following them online and reading about them in the newspaper. The authorities never find the people, and there's always something about the circumstances that are strange or don't add up. But deep down, I know the truth. They found me out there. Those things in the lake, whatever they are, they followed me home. And I don't think they're ever going to let me go. I hear the police sometimes still ask to look at my photos. I always say no. I don't need to look at them, because I'll never forget them. I feel like if I ever do, it might call them back to me. That feeling never leaves you, that something is watching you. Always watching. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear the footsteps, crunching softly in the snow, just outside my door. My name is Ben Walker, and I messed up, big time. It was back in September. I was 33. And I'd chucked my whole life in Portland, the soul-crushing tech job, the shoebox apartment, the endless doom scrolling, to chase something. I told everyone it was about photography, that I wanted to get the perfect shot of the Milky Way over the Alvord Desert in southeastern Oregon. But if I'm honest, I was just running away, and the Alvord, that place was made for running away. Imagine a giant, cracked dinner plate, stretching out for miles, surrounded by these jagged mountains that look like they're holding the rest of the world at bay. No cell service, no people, no noise. Just me, my beat-up Jeep, and the kind of sky you only see in pictures. Or so I thought. I rolled in mid-afternoon, parked the Jeep at the edge of the playa, that's what they call the dried up lake bed, and set up camp. Being out there, totally alone, it felt amazing, liberating. By sunset, I'd found a killer spot for photos, about half a mile from my tent. As the last bit of light faded, the temperature dropped like a rock, and the stars started popping out. I set up my tripod, messed with the settings on my DSLR, and took a few test shots. The stars were insane, like someone had spilled diamonds on black velvet. But then I saw it, a weird flicker. Way out on the horizon. Faint, like someone was messing with a dimmer switch on the edge of the world. At first, I figured it was just car headlights bouncing off the desert floor. But the lights didn't move like car headlights. They bobbed and weaved, almost like they were dancing. I stared at them for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe some campers screwing around, an ATV. But there was no sound, no engine noise, just dead silence. I snapped a few pictures of the lights, but when I checked the camera, the images were all dark and blurry. User error, I muttered, feeling like an idiot. I decided to pack it in and head back to camp. Those damn lights stayed right there, at the edge of my vision, flickering softly, like they were watching me walk away. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe some weird weather thing, or just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. I spent the day cruising the edges of the playa, taking pictures of the cracked earth and the mountains in the distance. By late afternoon, I was back at camp, scrolling through my shots and planning for another night of stargazing. That evening, as the sun was dipping below the horizon, I saw someone walking towards me. A woman mid to late 20s, I'd guess. Lean tan, wearing a ratty flannel shirt and jeans. Her long hair tied back in a messy braid. She had a canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. "You shouldn't be out here alone," she said, her voice flat, serious. "This place isn't safe." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm fine," I said. "Just here for some photos." She shook her head. "The lights. Don't follow them." Her words caught me off guard. "What lights?" She just pointed towards the horizon. "You've seen them, haven't you? They always show up at night. People think they're harmless, but they're not." I let out a nervous laugh, trying to brush it off. "So, what are they? UFOs? Ghosts?" She didn't smile. "I don't know, but people disappear out here. Just don't follow them." Before I could even ask her name, she turned and walked away, heading towards the mountains. I watched her until she was swallowed up by the shadows. The whole encounter left me feeling seriously creeped out, but I tried to shake it off. There's always some weirdo drifter in places like this, right? That night, the lights came back, brighter this time, closer. I was in the middle of a long exposure shot when I saw them again, dancing on the horizon like fireflies on slow-mo. They seemed to be pulsing, in sync, like they were forming patterns on purpose. My curiosity, or maybe just plain stupidity, got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and camera and decided to follow the lights. They didn't seem that far away. A mile or two tops. As I walked across the playa, the ground felt strangely warm under my feet, even though the air was freezing cold. The lights stayed just out of reach, always a little farther away than they seemed. After what felt like an hour, but was probably way less, I found myself in this circle on the playa. The ground here was smooth, almost polished, like someone had buffed it with sandpaper. The lights were all around me now, flickering in this slow, hypnotic dance. I set up my tripod and tried to get a picture, but my camera was dead. The battery, which I just charged, was totally drained. And that's when I heard it. The hum, low and deep, like it was coming from the ground itself. It vibrated through my whole body. I swung my flashlight around, but there was nothing there. No trees, no rocks, no animals. Just the lights and that damn hum. Then a shadow moved in the corner of my eye. A shadow moved in the corner of my eye. I whipped around, and there she was, the woman from earlier. She was standing at the edge of the circle, her face pale in the dim light. "I told you not to follow them," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. "You need to leave. Now." Before I could even open my mouth to ask her a question, the ground beneath us started to shake. Cracks spider-webbed across the polished surface, glowing with the same eerie light as the orbs. The hum got louder, almost deafening. It felt like my teeth were going to rattle out of my head. The woman grabbed my arm and yanked me away from the circle. "Run," she shouted, and we ran. We sprinted across the playa, the ground bucking and heaving behind us. The light from the cracks spilled out, chasing us like some kind of liquid nightmare. The hum had turned into a roar, a terrifying, primal sound that seemed to shake the very air. I risked a glance back, and that's when I saw it. Something was rising from the ground. A shape, if you could even call it that. It shifted and flickered, like it couldn't decide what form to take. It was massive, towering over the desert. And it was wrong. Unnatural. Just looking at it made my head throb, like my brain was trying to reject what my eyes were seeing. The woman shoved me forward. "Don't look at it," she screamed. "Just run." We finally made it back to my jeep. I was gasping for air, my lungs burning. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key in the ignition. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the engine roared to life. The woman climbed into the passenger seat without a word. As we sped away, the lights faded, and the roar dissolved back into silence. The desert returned to its normal, still self, as if nothing had happened. When we hit the highway, she finally looked at me. Her expression was grim, her eyes filled with a bone, deep wariness. "Don't come back here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not ever." I nodded, too shaken to even argue. I drove her to the nearest town, Fields, and dropped her off at the little general store. She slipped out of the jeep and vanished into the shadows without another word, without even telling me her name. A few days later, back in Portland, I finally went through my photos. The ones I'd taken before the lights appeared were fine, normal. But everything after that, corrupted, blurry, distorted, like the camera had captured something it wasn't supposed to see, something it couldn't process. I tried to find out more about the woman. I called the general store in Fields, asked around online, but no one seemed to know who she was. The locals just shrugged it off, said drifters came and went all the time. As for the lights, they told me it was probably just earthquake lights, or swamp gas, or some other natural phenomenon. But the look in their eyes, the way they avoided my gaze, told a different story. They were scared. I haven't been back to the Alvord Desert since, and I don't plan to go. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm staring out my window, I see faint, flickering lights on the horizon. And I hear that hum, echoing in my memory, a low, throbbing reminder of what's out there. I've learned to close the curtains and pretend they're not there, to tell myself it was just a dream, a hallucination. But deep down, I know the truth. I know they're waiting for me to make the mistake of following them again. And I know, with a sickening certainty, that if I do, I might not be so lucky next time. The desert keeps its secrets, and some secrets are best left buried. The woman's warning echoes in my mind. A chilling reminder of the night I almost lost myself in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Alvord Desert, a place where the line between reality and nightmare blurs, and the silence whispers tales of those who dared to follow the lights and never returned. My name's Mike Turner, and I'm 34. Let me tell you what happened to me a few months back in Hell's Canyon. It's messed me up, big time. I still can't wrap my head around it. I went out there to that crazy deep gorge on the Oregon, Idaho border to get my head straight. My life had pretty much gone down the toilet. Nasty breakup, a job I absolutely hated, and this feeling like I was just failing at everything. It was eating me alive. I figured some time out in the wilderness, just me and nature, would do me good. You know, hit the reset button. Boy, was I wrong. It was late August, and the sun was blazing when I got to Hell's Canyon. The heat was a killer, but the view, man, it was something else. The canyon just stretched on forever, like a giant had ripped open the earth. These massive cliffs and ridges were throwing these long, dramatic shadows, It was awesome, in the truest sense of the word. I parked my truck at the trailhead, got my gear together, and set off. My plan was simple: hike in, find a nice, quiet spot, camp out for a few days, and just reconnect. I had a map, a GPS, enough food and supplies for a week or more. I was all set. The first day was pretty chill. I found this sweet little spot by a creek, set up my tent. The sound of the water was relaxing, and it felt amazing to be completely alone. That night, I cooked some dinner on my portable stove and just stared up at the stars. They were brighter than any stars I'd ever seen. No city lights to wash them out. Honestly, for the first time in months, I felt a little bit of peace. Day 2, that's when things started to get weird. First, my water purifier crapped out. At first, it wasn't a huge deal. I figured I could just boil water. Right, wrong. Then I found out my fuel canister was leaking. I hadn't noticed it before. Now I'm down to scavenging for wood to keep a fire going. It was a pain. But I kept telling myself it was all part of the adventure. I came out here to rough it, to get away from all the modern conveniences, right? So, I'm exploring the area, and I start noticing these weird carvings on the trees. They were crude, almost like a kid had done them. Pictures of people and snakes. I figured maybe some other campers had made them, or maybe even old settlers, who knows. They gave me the creeps, though. I took some pictures with my phone, thinking I'd look them up later. That night, I'm lying in my tent, and I hear footsteps outside. Slow, heavy footsteps. I froze, clutching the knife I always keep by my sleeping bag. Then, just like that, they stopped. Dead silence. In the morning, I went out and found these huge footprints all around my campsite. Way too big to be human. But they didn't look like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. I tried to tell myself it was just a bear, but I knew, deep down, it wasn't. Day 3, things got worse. I decided to hike a bit farther out, hoping to find another water source. Instead, I stumbled on this old campsite. It looked like whoever had been there left in a real hurry. The tent was ripped to shreds. Supplies were scattered everywhere, and there were these dark stains on the ground. Blood, I'm pretty sure. There was a notebook half buried in the dirt. I picked it up and flipped through it. Most of it was unreadable, all smudged with dirt and water damage. But one phrase stood out, clear as day: "They're watching." I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to get out of there, right then and there. But, I don't know. My pride got the better of me. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, and I wasn't going to let some spooky stuff ruin it. I told myself the campsite was probably just some animal attack or something. An accident. But that night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, there were whispers too. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they sounded evil. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Just lay there, gripping my knife, my heart pounding every time a branch snapped or the wind howled. Day 4 was a blur. I was exhausted, running on pure fear. I decided, screw it, I'm packing up and heading back to my truck. Except my GPS had died overnight. Of course it had. And to top it all off, in my rush to explore, I left my map back at my main campsite. I tried to retrace my steps, but it was like the whole landscape had changed. Landmarks I'd made a mental note of were just gone, replaced by terrain I didn't recognize. The symbols on the trees were everywhere now, and I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Dark shapes, moving between the trees, always just out of sight. As the sun started to set, I came across something that just about made me lose it. There was a fresh animal carcass, right there on the trail. It was torn apart, like surgically. Flies were swarming all over it, and the smell. Oh God, the smell was awful. I had to force myself to walk around it, my stomach doing somersaults. The whispers came back that night, louder than before. And they weren't coming from outside the tent anymore. They were inside, right there with me. The fifth night was when I finally broke. I woke up to the sound of my tent zipper being opened. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, ready to fight whatever was out there. The beam of light hit the figure standing just outside. It was tall and thin, like unnaturally thin. Its arms and legs were way too long, and its face. I couldn't see its face, it was hidden in the shadows. But its eyes, they glowed, a sickly yellow that cut right through the darkness. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. That was it. I bolted. Didn't even bother packing up my gear. I just ran. My legs were burning. My lungs felt like they were going to explode, but I didn't stop. I could hear it following me, its footsteps uneven and getting closer as I scrambled over the rocks and rough terrain. And it spoke as it chased me. But it wasn't its own voice. It was mine. It was repeating my own thoughts, twisting them into something hateful.
"You're a failure, Mike,"
it hissed, using my own voice against me. "You'll never escape." I have no idea how long I ran. Eventually, I collapsed, bloody and delirious, near a ranger station. The rangers found me the next morning and airlifted me out of there. I told them everything, the whole story. But they didn't believe me. They said I was dehydrated, that I'd probably hallucinated the whole thing. They said that it was common to have mental breaks when put under stress in extreme environments. When they went back to the canyon to get my gear, they found nothing. No shredded tent, no symbols, no footprints. Nothing. It's been months since that trip, but I've never felt safe again. At night, I hear whispers in my apartment. I've found strange symbols scratched into my windows. Scratches on the walls that weren't there before. I thought I'd left Hell's Canyon behind, but I was wrong. Whatever was out there, it followed me home. I'm trapped in a living nightmare, and I don't know how to make it stop. It's like I'm being haunted, and there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's always there, just out of sight, waiting. And those whispers, they never stop. They're inside my head now, a constant reminder that I'm not alone, that I'll never be alone again. It's a part of me now, a dark passenger I can't shake off. This is my life now, and I'm terrified it's only going to get worse. I'm trapped, and I don't see a way out, not anymore. My name is Ben Parker, and I was, let's just say, 37 years young when I decided to pack my bags and head into the end of nowhere, specifically the Rogue River Wilderness in Oregon. To say my life was a dumpster fire would be an insult to actual dumpsters. My wife Sarah had walked out on me about 6 months earlier, and if that wasn't enough of a kick in the teeth, I got canned from my job as a journalist at the local rag shortly after. I was a mess, to put it lightly. I figured I needed to get the hell out of Dodge, strip everything back to basics, and find some peace and quiet, maybe some clarity. At least that's what I kept telling myself as I crammed my beat up old Jeep with a tent, some gear, and a notebook. Boy, was I naive. I had no clue how messed up your head could get when you're completely alone. I seriously underestimated how dangerous isolation could be. And by the time I realized, well, it was a little too late for that. The drive into the wilderness was pretty uneventful. Just me, my Jeep, and these winding roads cutting through what felt like a never-ending forest. The sun was shining, light filtering through the trees in these golden streaks, kind of pretty actually. I felt this weird mix of being excited and nervous. But the closer I got to the middle of nowhere, the more nervous I got. By the time I parked the Jeep at the trailhead, I was as alone as you could get. Not another car in sight, not another soul. Just me and the damn trees. I hiked a few miles down the trail. Nothing too crazy, before cutting off to find a little hideaway by the river. And man, I found the perfect spot. It was this small clearing, surrounded by these massive pines, and the Rogue River was right there, just rushing by. It was the perfect soundtrack. I pitched my tent, got a little fire pit going, and laid out my stuff. Honestly, for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of peace. The wilderness had this way of making all my problems, all that crap back in the real world, feel tiny, insignificant. That first night, I just sat by the fire, scribbling in my notebook. I wrote about the forest, the river, how weirdly heavy the silence felt. It got colder as the fire started to die down, so I eventually crawled into my sleeping bag. I fell asleep to the sound of the river, feeling strangely comforted. The next day, reality hit. Turns out, I wasn't exactly Bear Grylls. Getting a fire going in the damp morning air was a joke, and my attempt at fishing, laughable. By lunchtime, I was starving, frustrated, and that feeling of being completely alone started to sink in. It was like the solitude was seeping into my bones. I tried to keep myself busy, exploring the area, following the river upstream. That's when I found it, this abandoned campsite. It gave me the creeps, big time. The tent was collapsed, ripped up, and looked like it had been there for ages. There were a few things scattered around, like a rusty old cooking pot, a pair of boots, and this old, waterlogged notebook that was practically falling apart. The whole scene was just off, you know. There was no sign of whoever owned the stuff, no clue what had happened. I picked up the notebook, flipping through the soggy pages. Most of it was unreadable, but a few phrases stood out, voices in the trees, watching me, and can't trust him. Creepy, right? I took the notebook back to my camp. I don't know why. Maybe it was the journalist in me, always digging for a story. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to make sense of the entries. But the more I read, the more freaked out I got. Whoever wrote this stuff was seriously paranoid, convinced they were being watched. The last entry was barely legible. He's here. I have to leave. That night, I heard them, the whispers. At first, they were faint, like they were part of the wind rustling the leaves, the river gurgling. But as the night wore on, they got louder, more distinct. It sounded like a conversation, but I couldn't make out any of the words. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, that my mind was playing tricks on me. It didn't work. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. The next day, I was a wreck. Every little sound, every shadow, made me jump. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, my ears straining for anything that sounded out of place. I decided to hike deeper into the wilderness, figuring the exercise might clear my head. That's when I met him. This guy just appeared out of nowhere, stepping onto the trail ahead of me like he'd materialized from thin air. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with this scraggly beard and clothes that looked like they hadn't seen a washing machine in years. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and his eyes, man, they were sharp, like he was sizing me up, a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Didn't think anyone else would be out here," he said, his voice rough. "Yeah, same here," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just needed to get away for a while." He nodded slowly. "You camping alone?" The way he asked that question sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated, then said, "Yeah." He just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, then said, "Be careful. These woods have a way of messing with your head. People get lost out here." Before I could even respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the trees like a ghost. I stood there, heart pounding, his words echoing in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been watching me for a while, even before he showed himself on the trail. That night, the whispers came back, only this time they were louder, way louder. It was like they were all around me, a chorus of voices I couldn't understand, right outside my tent. I sat there by the fire, clutching that creepy notebook from the abandoned campsite, feeling like I was losing it. The writer's paranoia suddenly felt way too relatable. I kept glancing at the darkness beyond the firelight, half expecting to see that guy from the trail standing there, watching me, with that damn rifle of his. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling my camp. I grabbed the hatchet I'd brought, my hands shaking, and yelled out, "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped, but nobody answered. My heart was hammering in my chest. I scanned the shadows, but I couldn't see a damn thing. Eventually, the footsteps started up again, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, not even a wink. The next morning, I was done. I decided I was getting the hell out of there. I packed up my gear in record time, but as I started hiking back towards the trailhead, I realized something was seriously wrong. I was lost. The forest looked different, unfamiliar. I couldn't find the trail, no matter which way I turned. It was like the wilderness had swallowed me whole. I was starting to panic. By the time I stumbled upon the cabin, I was desperate. It was this small, run-down shack, practically hidden by overgrown bushes. The door creaked like something out of a horror movie when I pushed it open. Inside, it was just one room, filled with cobwebs and dust. In the middle of the room was a table, and on the table was another notebook. This one was brand new, not a speck of dirt on it. I opened it, my hands trembling, almost dropping the thing. The first page was blank, but on the second page, there was a single line, written in this neat, precise handwriting, "You can't leave." That was it. That was the moment I truly lost it. A wave of cold dread washed over me. I dropped the notebook like it was on fire, and backed out of the cabin, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. As I turned to leave, I saw him again. The guy from the trail. He was standing just outside the cabin, his rifle at his side. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched me, his eyes like ice. I ran. I ran like my life depended on it, because it probably did. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally stopped, I was gasping for air. My legs felt like jelly. The forest was silent now, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was heavy, suffocating, like the whole wilderness was holding its breath, waiting. Eventually, After what felt like an eternity, I found the trailhead. My Jeep was still there, thank God. I practically threw myself inside, fumbling with the keys, my hands still shaking like crazy. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there he was, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave, just watching. I never went back to the Rogue River wilderness, and to this day, I don't know what the hell happened out there. Was it all in my head? Was I just going crazy from the isolation? Or was there something else out there, something I can't explain? I don't have the answers. All I know is that I'll never forget the whispers, the footsteps, and that feeling, that bone, deep certainty, that I was never truly alone in those woods. And that's something that will stay with me forever. That is the conclusion of Ben's story. Let me know what you think of this rewrite. I tried to capture a more natural speaking voice while keeping the suspense and horror elements intact. Feel free to give me any feedback or suggest further improvements. My name is Rachel Walker, and I was 34 years old when it all went down. It was late September, and the crisp air and quiet of Hell's Canyon wilderness seemed like the perfect escape from the mess I'd left behind. See, I'm a travel nurse, so I've seen my share of emergencies, but losing a patient, a little boy named Leo, had really messed me up. I needed time to clear my head, so I packed my gear, made the drive to Hell's Canyon, and planned for a week of solitude. The first day was pretty chill. I parked my car at a trailhead and hiked a few miles into the wilderness, following a winding path that led to a small ridge overlooking the massive canyon. The view was insane. Jagged cliffs, endless sky, and a river that cut through the earth like a vein. I set up camp at the ridge's edge, pitched my tent, and let myself relax for the first time in months. I didn't expect peace to come easy, but that evening, I felt it. A stillness I hadn't felt in a long time. By the second day, though, things started to get weird. My GPS, a device I'd trusted on countless trips, started acting crazy. It placed me several miles off course, showing landmarks I hadn't seen and warning of turns where no trail existed. I had a map as backup, but the whole thing was unsettling. I shrugged it off and stuck to familiar trails, but a feeling that something was off lingered. That night, the first real sign of trouble showed up. I was sitting by the fire, eating a packet of rehydrated chili, when I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, carried by the wind, but unmistakable. Rachel, it called, soft and slow, like someone was speaking just beyond the firelight. I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. "Who's there?" I called out, grabbing my flashlight. The beam swept over the surrounding trees, but there was nothing. The voice didn't come again that night, but I slept with my knife within arm's reach. The next day, I decided to explore the ridge more thoroughly. I needed a distraction, something to keep my mind off the unease that was creeping in. The morning sun was warm, and the air was fresh, but as I descended the trail toward the canyon, I noticed something strange. A pile of rocks stacked neatly in a triangular formation sat in the middle of the path. It definitely hadn't been there the day before. I knelt to check it out, brushing my fingers over the rough stones. They were heavy, their edges worn smooth by time, and something about their placement felt deliberate, intentional even. I took a photo with my phone and moved on, chalking it up to some camper's boredom. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing, where I planned to rest before heading back to camp. That's when I saw him, a man sitting on a fallen log near the edge of the clearing. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a scruffy beard and sunburned skin. His clothes were worn, and his backpack looked ancient, patched with duct tape and fraying at the edges. He didn't acknowledge me at first, just stared out at the canyon. "He there?" I called, trying to sound friendly but keeping my distance. Didn't expect to see anyone out here. The man turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the canyon. "This place. It doesn't let people go." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You think you're alone, but you're not. The canyon takes what it wants." Before I could respond, he stood and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I called after him, but he didn't look back. Something about the encounter left me shaken. His warning felt more like a prophecy than the ramblings of a strange man. I hurried back to camp as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the shadows growing longer and more menacing. That night, the voice returned. It was louder this time, clearer. "Rachel," it said, and my heart stopped. It wasn't just calling my name, it was saying other things, things no one should know, details about Leo, the boy I'd lost. "You could have saved him," it whispered. "You didn't try hard enough." I jumped out of my tent, clutching my knife, and scanned the area with my flashlight. Again, there was nothing. No footprints, no movement, just the heavy silence of the wilderness. But the voice lingered, echoing in my mind long after it stopped. The next morning, I decided I was out of there. I packed up my gear and started hiking back toward my car. The trail felt unfamiliar, like the forest had shifted overnight. My GPS was useless, and the map no longer seemed to match the terrain. Panic started bubbling up in my chest as I realized I might be lost. That's when the storm hit. Dark clouds rolled in fast, and rain poured down in sheets, turning the dirt trails into slick mudslides. I slipped and fell several times, scraping my hands and knees. By the time I found shelter under a rocky overhang, I was soaked and shivering. The voice returned, louder than ever, cutting through the roar of the storm. "You brought this on yourself," it taunted. "You ran away, just like you always do. Leave me alone." I screamed into the void, my voice cracked, but the canyon's reply was a mocking silence. When the storm finally passed, I limped back to the trail, determined to find my way out. That's when I saw it. Another pile of rocks, this one directly in my path. But this time, something was different. At the top of the stack sat a small, weathered object. A toy car. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same toy car Leo had been holding when he came into the ER. There was no way it could be here. It wasn't possible. I stumbled backward, my head spinning. Then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and growing louder. I turned to see the man from the clearing. His face was different now, gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow and unseeing. He pointed to the canyon's edge. "It wants you," he said, his voice echoing like the wind. I ran. My injured leg screamed in protest, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The terrain blurred as I pushed past trees and rocks, my only thought to escape. I didn't stop until I tripped over a root and fell hard, hitting my head on a jagged stone. Pain shot through me, and my vision swam. When I came to, I was lying at the base of a steep slope, the canyon walls towering above me. I couldn't move my leg. The pain was excruciating. and when I looked down, I saw that my ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to drag myself forward, using my hands to pull my weight. The voice returned, softer now, almost gentle. "You can't run anymore," it said. "It's time to let go." For a moment, I considered giving up. The exhaustion, the pain, the overwhelming fear. It all felt like too much. But then I thought of Leo. I thought of his parents, their grief, and how they'd looked to me for answers I couldn't provide. I couldn't let this place take me, not like this. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound, and began crawling, inch by agonizing inch. I dragged myself through the dirt and rocks, ignoring the burning in my arms and the agony in my leg. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time lost all meaning. Finally, I saw it, the faint outline of a trailhead sign through the trees. A group of hikers found me the next morning, delirious and on the brink of collapse. They carried me back to safety, where I was airlifted to a hospital. The doctor said I'd broken my ankle and suffered severe dehydration, but I was lucky to be alive. They didn't understand what had happened out there, and I didn't try to explain. How could I? Weeks later, as I lay in bed recovering, I found something on my nightstand that made my blood run cold. A small pile of rocks, stacked neatly in a triangular formation, sat next to a photo of Leo. I stared at it for a long time, unable to move, unable to breathe. The canyon hadn't let me go, after all. It followed me. I tried my best to make the language more conversational and natural, while keeping the suspense and horror elements.
Let me know what you think.
Alright, let me tell you about the time I messed up. Big time. My name is Ben Carter, and I used to be a photographer. I say, used to be, because after what happened in the Umpqua National Forest, I haven't really been able to pick up a camera since. It all started because I wanted to get this epic shot, a picture that would make my career, you know. I was chasing mountain lions, not to hurt them, obviously, just to capture them on film, being their majestic selves in their natural habitat. Sounds cool, right? It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. A way for me to prove myself, maybe even run away from some of the crap in my life. Let's just say things weren't exactly peachy back home. So, I packed my Jeep with everything I thought I'd need: tent, a week's worth of grub, a satellite phone, just in casey, and all my camera gear. I was heading deep into the Umpqua National Forest in Oregon, to this place called Stonehaven Bluff. It's about 7 miles off trail, pretty remote. A buddy of mine, who's a bit of a nature freak, drew me a rough map. He said it was the perfect spot to find some wildlife, and that I'd probably have the place to myself. Seemed like a dream come true for a guy looking for that one perfect shot. I got there on a Monday morning, parked my Jeep at the trailhead, and started hiking. The plan was to camp on this ridge, Stonehaven Bluff. It was supposed to have this killer view, and I figured it was far enough out that I wouldn't have to elbow any other photographers out of the way to get my mountain lion pic. I'd done trips like this before, camping and hiking, but never this far into the wilderness. I wasn't worried though. I was prepared, and I was excited. The hiking was tough, let me tell you. Thick brush, uneven ground, the whole 9 yards. But I made it to the bluff, and man, the view was worth every drop of sweat. Imagine a valley stretching out as far as you can see, just a sea of green, with the treetops swaying in the breeze. The ridge itself was pretty steep on all sides, but I found this little clearing, just big enough for my tent. It felt like I'd found my own little piece of paradise. That first night was peaceful. Cooked some dinner on my little camp stove, set up my camera to take a time-lapse of the stars, and drifted off to sleep with the wind whispering through the trees. The next morning, I was reviewing the footage, and that's when I noticed the first weird thing. About halfway through the night, the time-lapse caught these lights. Faint, flickering lights on the ridge across from mine. They were far away, almost looked like fireflies, but they moved too, purposefully. They weren't just random, you know. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe some hikers with flashlights, or just a glitch in the camera. But it still bugged me. I spent that day exploring the woods, looking for any sign of mountain lions. Tracks, scat, claw marks, anything. Found nothing. But I did find something else, something way stranger. An old campsite. The tent was ripped to shreds, like something had attacked it. There was a backpack half, buried in the leaves, its contents scattered all over the place. Rusted cooking gear, some faded clothes, and then this a small, leather-bound notebook. Of course, I had to look. The entries were handwritten, kind of messy, like the person was in a hurry. At first, it was normal stuff. Saw a deer today. The view from the ridge is incredible. That kind of thing. But then, about halfway through, the tone changed. The writer started talking about strange things happening. Footsteps outside their tent. Whispers they couldn't quite make out, and those same lights I'd seen in my time lapse. The last entry was chilling. It said, "The Watcher is real. It's not human. If anyone finds this, leave. Don't look back." I stood there for a long time, holding that notebook, feeling like I was in some kind of horror movie. A part of me wanted to believe it was a joke, some prank left by a camper with a twisted sense of humor. But looking at that shredded tent, and feeling the silence of the forest pressing in on me, I started to doubt that. I decided to get out of there, head back to my own campsite. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. I kept thinking about that notebook, about the Watcher. I checked my tent zippers a million times, made sure my food was secured in a bare canister, a good distance away from camp. But still, I felt like something was watching me. Then, around midnight, I heard it. Branches snapping nearby. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, and shone the light around. Nothing. Just the trees, the shadows. Then the snapping stopped, and it was replaced by this heavy silence. And then I saw them. The lights. The same lights from the night before, but closer now. They were bobbing gently in the distance, and they didn't move like any flashlight or lantern I'd ever seen. It was like they were floating, not held down by gravity or anything. I was frozen, just staring at them, until they slowly faded back into the trees. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. Isolation can mess with your head, right? And I hadn't seen another soul since I got there. But when I checked my camera footage the next morning, I knew something was wrong. The lights were there again, clear as day, moving in those same weird, jerky patterns. And there was something else, too. Faint whispers in the audio. Low, murmuring sounds that I couldn't understand. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just messing with my head. It was real. And it was getting closer. I was trying to find a new trail, heading down this rocky slope, when my foot slipped. I went down hard, and a jolt of pain shot up my leg, my ankle. I knew right away it was bad. Getting back to camp took forever. Every step was agony. And by the time I made it, the sun was setting, and I was completely wiped out. I just collapsed into my tent, too exhausted to even eat. That night, the whispers came closer. I woke up to this rustling sound outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something. But then I heard it. Breathy, uneven breathing, right outside the thin fabric of my tent. I didn't move a muscle. This breathing, it circled the tent, slow and deliberate, like whatever it was checking me out. Then it stopped. A long silence, so quiet I could hear my own blood pumping. And then something brushed against the side of my tent, dragging along it, like a hand. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up at dawn, my tent was unzipped. I know for a fact I zipped it up tight before bed. My gear was scattered around, and my camera was gone. That's when the panic really started to set in. My ankle was swollen up like a balloon. I was running low on supplies, and now I was sure I wasn't alone. I spent that day hobbling through the forest, trying to find my camera. I had to find it, not just because it was expensive, but because it had the footage, the proof of what I'd seen. Instead of my camera, I found a cave. It was near the bottom of the ridge, hidden behind some bushes. The entrance was weird, though. It had these carvings etched into the rock, strange symbols I'd never seen before. They looked jagged, almost angry. Against my better judgment, I went inside. It was damp and cold, and it smelled like something had died in there. The cave wasn't very deep, but what I saw inside made me freeze. There, on the floor, was my camera, smashed to pieces, and around it, a pile of shredded clothes. Not my clothes. Some of them looked new, like they'd been ripped up recently. I stumbled out of that cave, my mind racing. I wanted to get out of there, to go home. But I could barely walk. And even if I could, the satellite phone wasn't getting any signal. I was trapped. The lights came back that night, closer than ever. They flickered just beyond the glow of my campfire, and this time, they didn't fade away. They surrounded my campsite, moving erratically like a pack of wolves circling their prey. And then I saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and thin, so thin it looked almost skeletal. I could barely make out its shape in the firelight, but its eyes glowed. I was paralyzed. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get away, but I couldn't move. The figure started to move closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was a puppet on strings. And then it spoke. It wasn't a language, not any language I'd ever heard. It was a low, guttural sound, but somehow I understood it. It said one word, Watcher. That's the last thing I remember clearly. I woke up on the forest floor, miles away from my camp. My ankle was throbbing, my body was covered in scratches, and all my gear was gone. I had no food, no water, no way to call for help. Just my busted ankle and the will to survive. It took me 2 days to limp my way back to the trailhead. 2 days of pure hell. I was dehydrated, delirious, barely able to stand. A hiker found me on the road, thank God. They called for help, and I was airlifted to a hospital. When I tried to tell them what happened, about the lights, the whispers, the figure in the woods, they gave me this look. Pity mixed with disbelief. I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was crazy. The authorities searched the area, but they never found my campsite, my gear, or that cave. They said there was no evidence of anything I described. They chalked it up to stress, dehydration, and isolation. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The Watcher is real. It's out there, in the Umpqua National Forest, waiting. They say I'm lucky to be alive. Maybe I am. But sometimes, I wonder if getting out was the lucky part. Because I'm still haunted. I can still see those glowing eyes. Hear those whispers in the back of my mind. I'll never be able to forget what happened in those woods. I have not touched a camera, and I cannot look at photos. And the worst part is, no one believes me. They think I'm crazy. But I know the truth. And the truth is, there's something evil out there. Something ancient and terrifying, hiding in the shadows of the Umpqua. And it's waiting for someone else to wander into its trap. So, if you ever find yourself in the Umpqua National Forest, and you see strange lights in the distance, or hear whispers in the dark, don't try to be a hero. Just turn around and run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Don't ever look back. My name is Sam Drake, and I used to fight fires. Retired now, but the flames, they never really leave you. I was 45 when I headed into the Oko Mountains in the spring of 2022. It had been a long 20+ years in the Bend, Oregon Fire Department, and honestly, it felt like the job was all I was. But retirement, instead of bringing peace, just brought back all the bad stuff. The calls I'd rather forget. The roaring fires, the screams, and the faces of those I couldn't save. Especially Mark, my best friend, my partner. He died on a call I walked away from. The guilt from that day, it ate me alive. I thought getting away, losing myself in the Oko Mountains might help. They're remote, rugged, the kind of place a man could disappear in, and maybe find something worth holding on to. I had a plan to be gone for 2 weeks, hiking and camping, ending up at the old fire lookout tower on Round Mountain. It felt right, you know. A way to honor Mark and maybe face down my own demons. The first few days were good. I followed a winding trail through thick forests of ponderosa pine, setting up camp near creeks and ridgelines. The air was crisp and clean, the nights cold, but nothing a good fire couldn't fix. I had a map, a compass, and enough supplies to last me. I knew how to handle myself out here. Also, I thought. It all started on the 3rd day, just before dark. I was on this narrow trail when I saw it, a charred tree, standing there like a skeleton against the green. Its bark was black, split open, like lightning had hit it. But there hadn't been any storms. I stopped to check it out, and that's when I saw something half buried in the dirt. I brushed the soil away and found an old firefighter's badge, tarnished but intact. The number on it. I didn't recognize it, but the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. It felt like a bad omen. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I sat by the fire, I swear I heard whispers on the wind. But whenever I looked, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Being alone like that, it can mess with you. Still, I slept with my knife close. The next morning, I found something even weirder, a pile of ashes and burned wood, arranged like a campfire, still warm. But here's the thing, there were no tracks leading to it or away from it. No sign that anyone had been there. It made 0 sense. I pushed on, telling myself it was some kind of prank, though who would be out here to do that? I had no idea. As I climbed higher, the air got colder, the terrain rougher. I was crossing this rocky slope when I slipped and twisted my ankle. It wasn't broken, but damn, it hurt. I had to stop and wrap it with the bandages from my first aid kit. It was a minor setback, but it slowed me down. By the time I reached the ridge where I planned to camp, the sun was already setting. That night, the whispers came back, louder this time. They seemed to be coming from all around me, like I was surrounded. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the fire and the stars, but then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my camp. My heart was pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows, but the footsteps kept going, fading away into the woods. By the 5th day, I was starting to regret this whole trip. The guilt that had driven me out here was now mixed with this growing sense of dread. I kept moving, determined to reach that lookout tower, but it was slow going. My ankle throbbed with every step, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I'd catch glimpses of movement, shadows flitting between the trees, but whenever I turned to look, nothing. It was late afternoon when I finally reached the fire lookout. The tower loomed above me, its wooden beams weathered but still standing. Climbing the steps was agony, but I forced myself to the top, hoping for, I don't know, some sense of accomplishment. Instead, I found a scene that made my stomach drop. The inside of the tower was a mess. The walls were covered in scratch marks, and these weird symbols carved into the wood. A journal lay open on the desk, its pages filled with frantic, scrawled writing. One entry stood out. The fire took him, but he is not gone. He's here, watching, waiting. Don't light the fire at night. As the sun set, I knew I should leave, but my ankle made going down too risky. I decided to spend the night in the tower, barricading the door as best I could. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and the forest below seemed alive with movement. I tried to sleep, but was jolted awake by a loud banging. Something was pounding on the door, hard and furious. I held my knife tight, hands trembling, as I backed into a corner. Then, as suddenly as it started, the pounding stopped, replaced by a low, guttural voice. "You don't belong here," it said. Morning came, and the door was still there. No sign of whatever had been hitting it. I climbed down carefully, my nerves shot. Every little noise made me jump. As I made my way back down the trail, I stumbled upon this old guy, sitting by a creek. He looked totally out of place, his clothes too clean for someone living out here. He nodded at me, his eyes sharp and unsettling. "Respect the forest," he said, his voice raspy. "Don't light the fire at night." Before I could even respond, he was gone, disappearing into the trees like he was never there. I mean, what was that about? I pushed on, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and that tower, but the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing denser, the trail harder to follow. That night, I gave in. It was too cold. I lit a fire. The warmth was a relief, but it didn't last. The flames seemed to draw the shadows closer, figures materializing at the edge of the firelight. One stepped forward, its form all smoky and ashy. "You brought this," it said, its voice like crackling wood. "You burned him. You left him." I tried to run, but my ankle gave out, sending me sprawling. The figure loomed over me, its presence suffocating. In a panic, I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it wildly. The figure recoiled, dissolving into smoke, but the effort left me drained. I woke up hours later, the fire long dead, my leg throbbing. I'd fallen badly, and this time I knew it was broken. My ankle was at a weird angle. Crawling was my only option now. It took me 2 days to crawl back to the trailhead, 2 days of pure hell. My body was scraped and battered, my spirit broken. A young ranger, barely older than 20, named Emily, found me slumped against my car, barely conscious. She called for help, and I was airlifted to a hospital in Bend. The doctors confirmed my ankle was shattered. They said it would never heal right, that I'd have a permanent limp. Funny thing is, that old firefighter's badge was still in my pocket, though I had no memory of putting it there. Months later, I went to Mark's grave. I left the badge there, a small offering to a memory I couldn't shake. I don't know if the things I saw in the Ocos were real, or just the product of my own messed up head. Maybe it was the guilt, the isolation, the injury, all playing tricks on me. What I do know is that I'll never go back there. The forest took something from me, and I'm not sure it's done. I still have nightmares. I see the flames, hear the whispers, feel the presence of that thing. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I think I hear Mark's voice, calling out to me from the other side of the fire. A reminder that some things, some people, they never truly leave you. And some fires, they never really go out. The forest remembers, even if we try to forget. And sometimes it comes calling to collect what it's owed. My new normal is the quiet life. I got a dog, a golden retriever I named Sparky. Ironic, I know. We walk most days, but I stick to well-worn paths, nowhere near a forest's edge. The limp is always there, a reminder of the mountain, of Mark, of everything I lost. I guess you could say I'm still lost in a way. Just not in the woods anymore. I started going to grief counseling. It helps a little. Talking about Mark, about the accident, about the things I saw, or think I saw. The therapist, Dr. Anya Sharma, she tells me it's normal to have these kinds of reactions to trauma. That the mind can create things to fill in the gaps, to try and make sense of the senseless. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I'm not so sure. It sounds an awful lot like those whispers in the woods. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, the Oco Mountains aren't done with me yet. Maybe the fire is still burning, somewhere out there, waiting for me to come back. Waiting to finally claim what it believes is its own. Maybe some debts, no matter how hard you try, can never truly be repaid. You just learn to live with them, like a shadow that follows you, always just out of sight, but never truly gone.